in the shadow of towering glass and steel, where gentrification's relentless march carved fresh scars across ancient brownstone flesh, there existed a Brooklyn unlike any other. This was Earth 1610, the ultimate universe, a realm where familiar streets wore unfamiliar faces, where the weight of destiny pressed heavier against the shoulders of the young, and where the very air seemed to hum with the electric potential of untold stories waiting to unfold. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of a modest apartment on Visions Academy Boulevard, its golden rays illuminating dust motes that danced like microscopic stars in the stillness. Here, in this sanctuary of middle-class aspiration and immigrant dreams, lived the Morales family, a constellation of three souls, bound together by love, struggle, and an unshakable faith in tomorrow's promise. Jefferson Davis stood before the bathroom mirror, his reflection a testament to transformation. The tattoos that once marked him as a soldier in the wars of the street now lay hidden beneath pressed shirts and honest sweat. His hands, once instruments of violence, in service to shadowy masters, now knew only the weight of responsibility, the gentle touch required to braid his son's hair, the firm grip needed to steady a wobbling bicycle, the tender embrace that could chase away nightmares born from video games played too late into the evening. But Jefferson's metamorphosis had not been swift, nor had it been easy. In the twisted labyrinth of his past, he had served as an enforcer for Wilson Fisk, the kingpin of crime, his loyalty purchased with promises of power and respect that tasted like ash in his mouth when morning came. The streets of Brooklyn had known his name then, whispered it in the kind of reverent fear reserved for hurricanes and house fires. Yet redemption, Jefferson had learned, was not a destination but a daily choice, a conscious decision to turn his back on the siren call of easy money and easier violence. The transformation had begun with Rio Morales, with her nurse's hands that could find a vein in the darkest room, and her heart that could locate hope in the most hopeless places. She had seen through the armor of his reputation to the man beneath, wounded, searching, desperate for a purpose that extended beyond the next job, the next score, the next fleeting moment of respect earned through fear. Rio moved through their small kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that love was often spelled L-I-S-T. Morning medication for Mrs. Chen upstairs. Permission slip for Miles's field trip. Grocery list for Jefferson's lunch. Appointment reminder for her own shift at Brooklyn General Hospital. Her scrubs, a soothing shade of lavender, bore the invisible weight of countless stories. The premature infant who had beaten the odds, the elderly man who had held her hand as he drew his final breath, the teenage mother who had named her daughter after the nurse who had coached her through labor with patience and grace. It was Rio who had insisted they move to this neighborhood, away from the gravitational pull of Jefferson's former life. A fresh start. She had called it, though they both understood that certain shadows followed a man no matter how many miles he put between himself and his past. But in this corner of Brooklyn, with its tree-lined streets and community gardens, its small businesses run by families who had arrived from every corner of the world seeking the same dream, they had found something precious: anonymity, tinged with hope. And then there was Miles Morales, 13 years old, and caught in that liminal space between childhood's last gasps and adolescence's first tentative steps. He sat at the kitchen table, his physics homework spread before him like a map to territories he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. Numbers and formulas danced across the page, each equation a small puzzle that his mind solved with an ease that both thrilled and troubled him. Intelligence, Miles had learned, was a double-edged sword in a place like Brooklyn. Too smart, and you risked the label that followed bright kids like a target painted on their backs. Not smart enough, and you risked falling through the cracks that yawned wide in an education system stretched thin by budget cuts and broken promises. So Miles had learned to navigate the narrow channel between those extremes, excelling just enough to please his parents, while remaining just ordinary enough to avoid unwanted attention. But ordinary was a mask that fit him poorly. In the quiet moments when he thought no one was watching, Miles would let his true nature slip through. His sketchbook, hidden beneath his mattress like contraband, contained worlds of his own creation. Superheroes who looked like him, who lived in neighborhoods he recognized, who faced challenges that mirrored his own in metaphorical dress. The pages were filled with characters who could disappear into shadows, who could strike with the force of lightning, who could bridge the gap between what was and what could be. "Mijo," Rio called softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided countless patients through their darkest hours. "Breakfast is ready." Miles looked up from his homework, his eyes dark brown pools that seemed to hold depths beyond his years meeting his mother's gaze. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition that neither fully understood, but both felt in their bones. It was the acknowledgement of potential, of paths not yet chosen, of destinies that waited in the wings like understudies preparing for their moment on stage. The family breakfast was a ritual as sacred as any religious ceremony. Jefferson read snippets from the newspaper aloud, his voice carrying stories of Spider-Man's latest heroics with a mixture of admiration and concern. The wall crawler had become Brooklyn's unofficial patron saint, a symbol of hope that swung through the urban canyons on webs of impossibility. Yet Jefferson, with his hard-earned knowledge of the street's true nature, understood the weight that such responsibility must carry. "They say he's just a kid," Jefferson mused, folding the paper with deliberate care. "Younger than you, Miles. Can you imagine?" Miles could imagine it, perhaps more vividly than his father knew. In his secret sketches, he had drawn himself in variations of the red and blue costume, had imagined what it might feel like to soar between buildings with nothing but will and web fluid between him and the hungry pavement below. But such thoughts were dangerous territory for a boy who had learned that standing out was often synonymous with standing alone. "I don't know why anyone would want to do that," Miles replied, his voice carrying just the right note of teenage disinterest. "Seems dangerous." Rio watched her son over the rim of her coffee cup, her nurse's intuition picking up on the subtle tells that others might miss the slight quickening of his pulse at his throat. The way his eyes avoided direct contact when he spoke about Spider-Man, the unconscious tapping of his fingers against the table in a rhythm that matched the web-slinger's movements, as shown in grainy cell phone videos. The morning routine continued its familiar dance. Jefferson kissed his wife goodbye with the tenderness of a man who had learned not to take such moments for granted. Rio gathered her things with the efficient grace of someone who had turned caring for others into both profession and calling, and Miles shouldered his backpack, heavy with textbooks and dreams in equal measure. As the family prepared to scatter to their respective corners of the city, none of them could have imagined that this would be among the last of their ordinary mornings together. None of them suspected that destiny was already spinning its web, drawing together the threads that would soon transform their quiet life into something extraordinary and terrifying and beautiful all at once. The Brooklyn streets outside hummed with their usual symphony children's laughter, mixing with car horns, the rhythmic bounce of basketballs against chain-link fences, the distant rumble of subway trains, carrying dreams and disappointments in equal measure. Somewhere in the urban maze, a spider waited in a laboratory, its bite pregnant with possibility. Somewhere in the shadows, a prowler prepared for a heist that would change everything. And somewhere in the space between heartbeats, the ordinary world held its breath, ready to give birth to legend. Miles Morales walked these streets as he had 1,000 times before, unaware that he was taking his final steps as merely human. The boy who would become Spider-Man was still just a boy, his feet firmly planted on sidewalk concrete, his head filled with the mundane concerns of homework and friendship, and the eternal mystery of what tomorrow might bring. But tomorrow, as any spider could tell you, was a web already being woven. Deep beneath the gleaming towers of Manhattan, in laboratories where ambition wore a lab coat and ethics were filed away in forgotten folders, Norman Osborn stood before a wall of monitors, displaying data that pulsed like a digital heartbeat. The Oscorp building stretched above him, a monument to corporate power and scientific achievement. But here in the basement levels where security clearances came in shades of classified and beyond, the real work was done. The wall crawler had become more than just New York's protector. He had become Osborn's obsession, a puzzle that gnawed at the industrialist's mind with the persistence of a fever dream. Every swing through the city, every villain defeated, every impossible feat of strength and agility was another reminder of the power that had slipped through Osborn's fingers like spider silk in a hurricane. Project 42, he whispered to the empty laboratory, his voice echoing off walls lined with specimens that defied natural law. The recreation of the perfect Spider-Man. The original experiment had been an accident, a cosmic confluence of radioactive spider bite and teenage DNA that had produced something unprecedented in the annals of human evolution. But accidents, Osborn knew, were simply uncontrolled experiments, and anything uncontrolled could be harnessed, replicated, improved upon. Science was about taking the impossible and making it inevitable. The laboratory hummed with the quiet menace of machines that had pushed past the boundaries of ethical research into territories where morality became a luxury few could afford. Tanks filled with genetic material lined the walls like transparent tombstones, each one a failed attempt to recreate the miracle that had transformed Peter Parker from ordinary teenager into extraordinary hero. The failures floated in chemical suspension, grotesque reminders of the thin line between evolution and abomination. But this spider, this specimen designated as Subject 42, was different. Its genetic code had been carefully crafted. Every strand of DNA a note in a symphony of controlled mutation. Where nature had relied on chance, Osborn had applied science. Where accident had created one Spider-Man, intention would create something better, stronger, more compliant. The spider moved across its glass habitat with predatory grace, its 8 legs carrying death in a package no larger than a child's thumb. Its bite contained not just venom, but possibility, the power to transform, to transcend, to become something more than human. In its simple arachnid brain, it carried the blueprint for godhood, wrapped in silk and waiting for the right moment to strike. Miles away, in a warehouse district where shadows pooled like spilled ink, and honest work was as rare as unicorns, Aaron Davis adjusted his mask and checked his equipment one final time. The Prowler was a creature of the night, a ghost who moved through the industrial underbelly of New York with the fluid grace of someone who had learned that survival often depended on staying invisible. Aaron's relationship with his nephew was complicated, a knot of love and protection and terrible, crushing guilt. He saw in Miles a reflection of what he might have been if the world had offered different choices, better options, clearer paths to redemption. But the streets had claimed Aaron long before Miles was born, and once the streets had their hooks in a man, they rarely let go without drawing blood. The Prowler persona was Aaron's attempt to thread the needle between survival and something approaching heroism. He stole from corporations that wouldn't miss the money, targeted criminals who preyed on the innocent, operated in the gray spaces where traditional morality became a luxury of the privileged. It wasn't heroism in any classical sense, but it was the closest thing to righteousness that a man like Aaron Davis could manage. Tonight's target was Oscorp specifically, a shipment of experimental materials that were scheduled for transport to a subsidiary laboratory upstate. The cargo manifest was deliberately vague, listing only biological specimens and research materials. But Aaron's sources had whispered of something more significant, something worth enough to make the considerable risks worthwhile. The warehouse was a fortress of concrete and steel, its windows, black eyes staring out at the industrial wasteland that surrounded it. Security was minimal but professional, the kind of setup that spoke to corporate efficiency rather than genuine concern about theft. After all, who would be foolish enough to steal from Norman Osborn? Aaron dropped through a skylight with the practiced silence of a man who had spent years learning to move like liquid shadow. His armor, a masterpiece of stolen technology and street-smart improvisation, absorbed impact and muffled sound, transforming him from man to ghost to memory in the span of a heartbeat. The warehouse floor stretched before him, filled with shipping containers and loading equipment arranged in geometric precision. The target container was exactly where his intelligence had indicated, marked with hazard symbols that seemed to glow with malevolent purpose in the dim emergency lighting. Aaron's tools made quick work of the electronic lock, circuits sparking and dying as his override systems convinced the security apparatus that all was well, that nothing worth noting was happening in this forgotten corner of Oscorp's empire. Inside the container, Aaron found exactly what he had expected, and something he hadn't. Research equipment worth a small fortune sat in carefully packed foam. ready for transport to facilities where moral flexibility was considered a job requirement. But nestled among the devices, almost as an afterthought, was a smaller container marked only with a biohazard symbol and a number. 42. Curiosity, Aaron reflected later, was a luxury that men in his position couldn't afford. But the container was small, easily portable, and something about it spoke to the part of his mind that had always been attracted to puzzles, to mysteries, to the hidden mechanisms that made the world turn. Without fully understanding why, he slipped the container into his equipment bag alongside the more valuable but less intriguing electronic devices. The theft itself was executed with professional precision. Aaron was in and out of the warehouse in less than 15 minutes, his presence registered only as a minor glitch in the security system logs, a digital hiccup that would be attributed to equipment malfunction and forgotten by morning. By the time anyone discovered the theft, the Prowler would be nothing more than urban legend and insurance claim. But urban legends, like genetically engineered spiders, had a way of taking on lives of their own. Aaron's journey home took him through the familiar streets of Brooklyn, his motorcycle purring through neighborhoods where every corner held a memory, and every alley whispered stories of choices made and unmade. The container in his bag seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, as if whatever lay inside was aware of its liberation from corporate custody and eager to fulfill its purpose. The apartment that Aaron shared with solitude and the occasional visit from his nephew was a study in controlled chaos. Technology in various stages of repair and modification covered every available surface, while surveillance monitors displayed feeds from across the borough, digital eyes that helped him keep watch over the territory he had claimed as his own. It was here, in this electronic cave, that the Prowler shed his armor, and Aaron Davis tried to remember what it felt like to be simply human. The stolen equipment found places among his existing collection, expensive devices that would eventually be sold to buyers who asked no questions and paid in cash that left no trails. But the container marked 42 remained sealed, its contents a mystery that called to him with increasing urgency as the night wore on. When Aaron finally opened the container, he found a marvel of biological engineering that defied easy classification. The spider was beautiful in the way that perfect predators always were: elegant, efficient, deadly. Its coloration shifted in the fluorescent light, patterns of red and black that seemed to flow like liquid across its carapace. It moved with purpose, as if aware that it had been freed for a reason, as if it understood that its moment had finally arrived. Aaron studied the creature with the fascination of a man who had spent his life appreciating the elegant solutions that nature and technology could provide. The spider was clearly the product of extensive genetic modification, its very existence a testament to humanity's hubris and genius in equal measure. But it was more than just a scientific curiosity. There was something in its movements, something in the way it oriented itself toward the apartment door, that suggested purpose beyond mere survival. Without fully understanding the implications of his decision, Aaron decided to keep the spider. It seemed cruel to destroy something so perfectly crafted, so obviously the result of painstaking scientific effort. Besides, his nephew would find it fascinating. Miles had always been drawn to creatures that others found frightening, always eager to understand the mechanisms that made the natural world function. The container that had held Subject 42 was carefully cleaned and stored away, its biohazard warnings dismissed as corporate paranoia. The spider itself found a new home in a terrarium that Aaron hastily constructed from available materials, a temporary habitat until he could build something more suitable for such an extraordinary specimen. As the night deepened and Aaron finally allowed himself to consider sleep, he had no way of knowing that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just his nephew's life, but the very nature of heroism itself. The spider settled into its new environment with apparent contentment, its alien intelligence already beginning to process the scents and sounds of its surroundings, cataloging potential hosts with the methodical precision of a heat-seeking missile. In laboratories across the city, Norman Osborn's other experiments continued their grotesque ballet of failed transformation. In the Parker household, Peter slept the fitful sleep of a teenager who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. In the Morales apartment, Miles dreamed of swinging through urban canyons on threads of impossibility, unaware that his dreams were about to become prophetic. And in Aaron Davis's apartment, A spider that should not exist, waited with the patience of evolution itself, ready to fulfill the purpose for which it had been so carefully crafted. The bite that would change everything was still hours away, but destiny had already begun to weave its web around the unsuspecting boy who would soon carry the name of Spider-Man into a new and more complicated future. The city slept, but transformation never rested. In the shadows and the spaces between heartbeats, the impossible prepared to become inevitable. The first sign that Miles Morales' world had shifted on its axis came not with fanfare or revelation, but with the quiet confusion of a teenage boy staring at his own hand as if it belonged to someone else entirely. 3 days had passed since the spider bite. 3 days of dismissing the strange puncture wounds on his palm as nothing more than a minor accident. 3 days of attributing his occasional dizziness to late nights spent sketching superheroes he would never admit to creating. But hands, Miles discovered, were not supposed to stick to walls. It happened during first period physics, Mr. Warren's voice droning through the fundamentals of electromagnetic force, while Miles found his attention drifting toward the window and the city beyond. His palm had been resting casually against the concrete block wall beside his desk, a gesture so unconscious that he hadn't even realized he was making it until he tried to move his hand and found it anchored as if by invisible glue. The panic was immediate and overwhelming. Miles tugged gently at first, then with increasing desperation as he realized that his hand was somehow bonded to the wall at a molecular level. Around him, his classmates continued taking notes and staring at the clock with the glazed expressions of teenagers trapped in educational purgatory, blissfully unaware that reality was quietly unraveling 3 seats from the window. Mr. Morales. Mr. Warren's voice cut through the classroom hum like a scalpel through silk. Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate the principle of adhesive force for the class? Miles felt heat rise in his cheeks as every head in the room turned toward him. His hand was still stuck to the wall, his fingers spread against the painted concrete in what must have looked like the most elaborate and pointless attempt at cheating in academic history. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he yanked his hand free, leaving behind microscopic traces of himself bonded to the classroom wall, the first physical evidence of his transformation. "Sorry, Mr. Warren," Miles mumbled, flexing his fingers and marveling at how normal they looked despite what they had just accomplished. "I was just thinking." The rest of the morning passed in a haze of experimentation disguised as fidgeting. Miles discovered that the adhesion was controllable, triggered by some combination of conscious will and unconscious need. He could make his fingertips stick to his desk, to his textbook covers, even to the smooth surface of his phone screen, with a precision that defied every law of physics he had ever learned. But if the wall crawling was strange, it was nothing compared to what happened during lunch. Miles had always been a careful eater, the product of a mother who believed that proper nutrition was the foundation of success in all areas of life. But today, as he bit into the sandwich Rio had prepared with her usual loving attention to detail, something shifted in his mouth. A tingling sensation spread across his tongue, followed by a pressure that built behind his teeth like steam in a kettle approaching the boiling point. The first venom blast was accidental. It happened while Miles was taking a drink of water, his mouth full of liquid when the strange pressure reached critical mass. The bioelectric energy that had been building in specialized glands he didn't even know he possessed discharged all at once, sending a controlled burst of stunning force through the water and into the plastic bottle he was holding. The bottle exploded, not with fire or shrapnel, but with the sudden release of stored potential energy, plastic fragments scattering across the cafeteria table, while every student within a 10-foot radius turned to stare at the boy who had apparently just made his lunch explode, through sheer force of will. "Dude," said Genki Lee, his voice filled with the kind of awe usually reserved for magic tricks and video game achievements. "How did you do that?" Genki Lee had been Miles' closest friend since elementary school. A partnership forged in the shared trenches of being slightly too smart for their surroundings and slightly too interested in comic books to be considered completely normal. Where Miles was quiet and introspective, Genki was effusive and analytical, his mind a catalog of superhero trivia and scientific curiosity that made him both the ideal confidant and the most dangerous possible witness to unexplainable phenomena. "I don't know," Miles answered honestly, staring at the plastic fragments scattered across the table like evidence of a crime he couldn't remember committing. The bottle must have been defective or something. But Genki's eyes, magnified slightly by the thick-rimmed glasses he wore with unconscious pride, held the kind of speculative gleam that meant he was already forming theories, connecting dots that Miles wasn't even aware existed. It was a look that made Miles simultaneously grateful for his friend's loyalty and terrified of his intellectual curiosity. The afternoon brought new revelations, each one more impossible than the last. During gym class, Miles found himself moving with a fluid grace that drew startled looks from classmates who had previously known him as competent but unremarkable. His reflexes had sharpened to supernatural levels, allowing him to dodge balls that should have caught him flat-footed and leap over obstacles that should have required careful navigation. But it was the moment of true invisibility that convinced Miles that he was either going insane or undergoing some kind of biological transformation that defied every textbook definition of possible. It happened in the locker room, surrounded by the usual chaos of teenage boys changing clothes and engaging in the complex social rituals that passed for bonding in high school athletics. Miles had been sitting on a bench, lost in thought about the day's strange events, when he noticed that the conversations around him had taken on a peculiar quality, as if he were listening to them from a great distance or through some kind of auditory filter. He looked down at his hands and saw nothing. The camouflage was perfect, so complete that for a moment Miles wondered if he had somehow left his body entirely, become a disembodied consciousness floating in the athletic department's industrial fluorescent lighting. But when he flexed his invisible fingers, he could feel them move, could sense the air displaced by their motion, even as his eyes insisted that nothing was there. The panic that followed was pure and primal. Miles concentrated with desperate intensity, willing himself back into visibility with the same focus he had once applied to particularly challenging math problems. Slowly, like an image developing in a photographer's darkroom, his body began to reappear first as a faint outline, then as a ghostly translucent shape, finally solidifying into normal teenage flesh and blood. None of his classmates had noticed. The locker room continued its usual symphony of slamming metal doors and adolescent conversation, oblivious to the minor miracle of human invisibility that had just occurred 3 feet from the wrestling mats. Miles dressed quickly and left school with his mind spinning like a centrifuge, trying to process the impossible evidence of his own transformation. The walk home took him through familiar streets that now seemed charged with new significance. Every shadow a potential hiding place, every rooftop a platform from which he could theoretically leap with superhuman grace. But it was the conversation with his Uncle Aaron that evening that transformed confusion into something approaching understanding. Aaron had been waiting in the apartment when Miles arrived home, his presence both comforting and slightly unsettling in the way that visits from family members with complicated histories often were. He was sitting at the kitchen table, examining something small and metallic, with the focused attention of a man who made his living understanding the hidden mechanisms of the world. "How was school, nephew?" Aaron asked, without looking up from his work, his voice carrying the easy affection that had always characterized their relationship. "Weird," Miles answered honestly, dropping his backpack by the door and moving to peer over his uncle's shoulder. "What are you working on?" "Just a little project," Aaron replied, his hands continuing their precise adjustments to what looked like a miniature electronic device. "Something I picked up from work. You know how it is, one man's trash is another man's treasure." Miles nodded, though his attention was more focused on the strange, tingling sensation that had begun in his fingertips the moment he had entered the apartment. It was similar to what he had experienced before the wall-crawling incidents, but more intense, as if his newly acquired abilities were responding to some kind of external stimulus. "Uncle Aaron," he said carefully, unsure how to broach the subject of impossible biological transformations with someone who had always prided himself on being grounded in reality. "Have you ever heard of people developing unusual abilities?" Aaron's hands stilled, his attention shifting from the device to his nephew's face with an intensity that made Miles suddenly aware of how much he had revealed with that single question. "What kind of abilities?" Aaron asked, his voice carefully neutral. Miles hesitated, caught between the desire to confide in someone he trusted and the instinctive understanding that some secrets were too dangerous to share. even with family. But the events of the day had left him feeling isolated and confused, desperately in need of guidance from someone who might understand the weight of carrying power that couldn't be easily explained. Hypothetically, Miles said, choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon, what if someone could stick to walls, or turn invisible, or shoot some kind of energy from their hands? Aaron set down his tools and turned in his chair to face his nephew directly. In his eyes, Miles saw something flicker recognition, perhaps, or understanding, or the kind of careful calculation that preceded decisions with far-reaching consequences. Hypothetically, Aaron said slowly, I'd say that someone with those kinds of abilities would need to be very careful about who they trusted with that information. The world isn't always kind to people who are different, Miles. Sometimes being special is the most dangerous thing you can be. The conversation continued late into the evening, Aaron's words weaving themselves into Miles's consciousness like threads in a tapestry of caution and possibility. His uncle spoke of responsibility and power, of the weight that came with being exceptional in a world that feared exception, of the choices that defined not just what a person could do, but who they chose to become. But beneath Aaron's careful words, Miles sensed something else, a recognition that went beyond theoretical understanding, a familiarity with the concepts of power and secrecy that suggested personal experience rather than abstract knowledge. It was a revelation that raised more questions than it answered, questions that Miles wasn't sure he was ready to ask. That night, Miles lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his hands pressed flat against his sheets as he experimented with the adhesive properties that had transformed his world. Through his bedroom window, the city sparkled with electric promise, its million lights, calling to something deep in his genetic code that whispered of swinging and soaring, and the kind of freedom that could only be found in the space between buildings. But freedom, Miles was beginning to understand, was just another word for responsibility. And responsibility, as any spider could tell you, was a web that once entered, could never be fully escaped. The boy who had walked to school that morning would never walk anywhere the same way again. Miles Morales was becoming something new, something unprecedented, something that the world wasn't quite ready to understand. The only question was whether he was ready to understand himself. The news came through the city like a sonic boom in reverse, not the explosive announcement of arrival, but the devastating silence that follows the sudden absence of something essential. Peter Parker, the amazing Spider-Man, defender of New York and living symbol of impossible heroism, was dead. Miles first heard it from the television in the Visions Academy common room, the anchor's voice carrying words that seemed to drain all color from the world around him. A final battle with the Green Goblin, an explosion that had lit up the night sky over Queens. A body recovered from the wreckage, the red and blue costume singed but unmistakable, the mask removed to reveal a face that was heartbreakingly young. "He was just a kid," whispered a girl from Miles's chemistry class, her voice breaking on the last word. "He was our age." Around the room, students sat in stunned silence, their phones forgotten in their hands, as the reality of Spider-Man's mortality settled into their consciousness like sediment in still water. The wall crawler had been more than just a superhero to the young people of New York. He had been proof that youth and idealism could stand against the darkness that seemed to seep into every corner of modern life. His death was not just the end of a person, but the collapse of a possibility they had all carried without fully realizing it. Miles felt the news like a physical blow, a punch to the solar plexus that left him gasping for breath in a room full of people who were suddenly too close, too loud, too present. The tingling in his fingers that had become his constant companion over the past few weeks intensified, as if his newly acquired powers were responding to the emotional earthquake that had just shifted the foundation of his world. But beneath the shock and grief, something else stirred, a recognition that felt almost like guilt, though Miles couldn't quite identify why. It was as if he had been given a gift at the exact moment it had been stolen from someone else, as if his transformation, from ordinary teenager to something extraordinary, had somehow contributed to the universe's cruel mathematics of balance. The details, when they emerged over the following days, painted a picture of heroism that felt almost mythological in its tragic grandeur. Peter Parker had been investigating Norman Osborn's increasingly erratic behavior, following leads that suggested the industrialist had descended into madness, fueled by his obsession with power and transformation. The Green Goblin persona had emerged from that obsession like a butterfly from a cocoon, beautiful and terrible and utterly destructive. Their final battle had taken place in an Oscorp facility in Queens, a laboratory where the line between scientific advancement and megalomaniacal ambition had been crossed so thoroughly that it was no longer visible in the rearview mirror. Peter had arrived to find Osborn in the process of implementing something called the Ultimate Protocol, a genetic modification program designed to create an army of enhanced soldiers under his direct control. What followed was a confrontation that combined the intimate brutality of personal vendetta with the cosmic scope of science fiction horror. The Green Goblin, enhanced by experimental serums that pushed human biology past its breaking point, had fought with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Peter Parker, carrying the weight of responsibility that had defined his life since a radioactive spider bite changed his destiny, had fought with the quiet determination of someone who understood that some battles must be won regardless of their cost. The explosion that ended both their lives had been visible from Manhattan, a pillar of fire and smoke that rose into the night sky like a funeral pyre for the age of innocence. When the emergency responders finally cleared the wreckage, they found two bodies, one in the remains of a Green Goblin glider, the other in a red and blue costume that had become synonymous with hope. Miles learned these details not from news reports, which focused on the public persona of Spider-Man, with the reverent distance of journalists covering a war they had never fought, but from conversations he overheard between his father and other police officers who had worked the scene. Their voices, when they thought no one was listening, carried the shell-shocked quality of men who had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of what was possible in the world they had sworn to protect. Kid couldn't have been more than 17, Jefferson Davis told Rio one evening, his voice heavy with the particular sorrow that came from seeing young lives cut short by violence. Had this photo in his wallet graduation picture from some fancy science school, honor student, apparently, scholarship to Empire State University. Rio's response was lost in the sound of running water as she washed dishes with the mechanical precision of someone working through grief. But Miles caught the way her shoulders tensed, the slight pause in her movements that indicated she was processing information that hit too close to home. The city mourned with the intensity of a population that had lost not just a protector, but a fundamental assumption about the nature of heroism. Makeshift memorials sprang up throughout the 5 boroughs, spider symbols drawn in chalk on sidewalks, red and blue flowers left at the base of buildings where Spider-Man had been photographed. Vigils where people stood in silence and tried to make sense of a world that suddenly felt more dangerous, more uncertain, more dependent on the courage of individuals willing to stand against the darkness. Miles found himself drawn to these memorials with a compulsion he couldn't entirely explain. Each one felt like a piece of evidence in a trial where he was simultaneously judge, jury, and defendant, a trial centered around the question of what he had been doing while Peter Parker was dying to save a city that included Miles among its millions of potential victims. The answer to that question was devastating in its banality. While Spider-Man was making his final stand against forces that threatened not just New York, but the fundamental concept of genetic integrity, Miles Morales had been in his bedroom, experimenting with his new abilities by practicing how to stick to his ceiling without leaving marks that would raise questions from his parents. He had been invisible, in more ways than one. The guilt that followed this realization was not the sharp, immediate pain of physical injury, but the slow, grinding ache of a weight that would never fully lift from his shoulders. Miles began to understand that his powers came with more than just the responsibility to help others. They came with the knowledge that his decision not to use them was itself a choice, with consequences that rippled outward like stones, thrown into still water. The question that haunted his sleepless nights was simple and unanswerable. Could he have made a difference? If he had somehow found the courage to reveal his abilities, to seek out Spider-Man and offer whatever assistance his untrained powers might have provided, would Peter Parker still be alive? Would the city still have its protector? Would the universe still make sense in the way it had before death reminded everyone that even heroes were mortal? These thoughts followed Miles through his daily routine with the persistence of shadows, coloring every interaction with the knowledge that he was living a lie of omission. When his teachers spoke about Spider-Man's sacrifice in hushed, reverent tones, Miles felt like a fraud for accepting their sympathy. When his classmates theorized about who might step up to fill the void left by the wall crawler's death, Miles bit his tongue to keep from screaming that the answer might be sitting 3 desks away, paralyzed by fear and self-doubt. The city's response to Spider-Man's death was both tribute and transformation. New York had always been a place where the impossible became routine, where citizens learned to navigate around superhuman battles the way other people navigated around construction sites. But Peter Parker's death marked the end of an era of assumed protection, the collapse of the comfortable illusion that someone would always be watching, always be ready to web up the falling debris and catch the tumbling civilians. Crime rates began to rise as predators tested the waters of a city without its most visible guardian. The enforcers grew bolder in their territorial disputes. The Kingpin's organization expanded its operations with the confident swagger of a cancer that had just learned its primary opposition had been eliminated. Even petty criminals seemed to move with a new swagger, as if Spider-Man's death had returned a fundamental advantage to those who operated outside the law. Miles witnessed this transformation during his daily walks through Brooklyn, his enhanced senses picking up details that others missed, the subtle shift in body language that indicated someone was carrying a weapon, the nervous energy of drug dealers who were expanding into territories they had previously considered too risky, the way ordinary citizens moved through the streets with slightly hunched shoulders and quicker steps, as if proximity to danger had become the default rather than the exception. But it was during one of these walks, 3 weeks after Peter Parker's funeral, that Miles encountered the moment that would define the rest of his life. The robbery was taking place in broad daylight, a fact that would have been unthinkable during Spider-Man's reign, but had become increasingly common in the power vacuum that followed his death. 3 men with guns had cornered a young mother and her daughter outside a bodega, their demands for money and jewelry delivered with the casual cruelty of predators who had grown accustomed to easy prey. Miles saw it happen from across the street, his enhanced hearing picking up the woman's terrified pleas and her daughter's crying from a distance that would have made the scene invisible to normal senses. The tingling sensation that had become his constant companion intensified, his body's way of preparing for action even as his mind recoiled from the implications of intervention. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, invisible to the unfolding drama, but hyper-aware of every detail, the way the woman's hands shook as she fumbled with her purse, the innocent confusion in the little girl's eyes as she tried to understand why the nice men were making her mother cry, the casual way the lead gunman checked his watch, as if armed robbery was just another appointment in his daily schedule. This was his moment. This was the test that would determine whether the powers he had been given were a gift or a curse, whether he was worthy of the legacy that had died with Peter Parker, or just another bystander who happened to be able to stick to walls and turn invisible. Miles took a step forward, his hands already beginning to fade from view as his camouflage ability responded to his emotional state. He could feel the bioelectric energy building in his palms, the venom blast charging like a weapon that nature had never intended but science had made possible. All he had to do was cross the street, render the gunman unconscious with his touch, and disappear before anyone could ask questions that he wasn't ready to answer. But fear, Miles discovered, was its own kind of paralysis. The fear wasn't for his own safety. His powers had already shown him that he was more durable, more agile, more capable than any normal teenager had a right to be. The fear was for what would come next, for the questions that would follow, for the attention that would inevitably focus on a new costumed figure in a city that was still mourning its previous protector. Spider-Man's death had taught Miles something that all the comic books and movies had failed to convey. Heroism wasn't just about having the power to help others. It was about accepting that once you started helping, you could never really stop. Every person you saved created an obligation to save the next person, and the next, until your entire existence became defined by other people's needs and crises. Peter Parker had been 17 when he died, just 4 years older than Miles was now. He had never had a normal life, never experienced the luxury of walking through the world without feeling responsible for every injustice he witnessed. His teenage years had been consumed by a responsibility that he had never asked for but could never abandon. Miles watched the robbery unfold with the crystalline clarity of enhanced senses and heightened emotional stakes. He saw the exact moment when the woman's desperation overcame her fear, when she threw her purse at the lead gunman and tried to run with her daughter. He saw the casual way the criminal raised his weapon, the mechanical precision of a man who had performed this script countless times before, and he saw himself turn away. The decision was made in the space between heartbeats, the choice of a 13-year-old boy who was not yet ready to accept the weight of the world on his shoulders. Miles activated his camouflage and walked away, his invisibility both literal and metaphorical, as he removed himself from a situation that demanded more courage than he possessed. Behind him, the sound of a gunshot echoed off the brownstone walls like a judge's gavel, sealing a verdict he would carry for the rest of his life. The woman survived. Miles learned this from local news reports that covered the incident with the perfunctory attention given to urban violence that had become too common to merit extensive coverage. She had been wounded in the leg but would recover fully. Her daughter had escaped unharmed, though the psychological scars of witnessing her mother's assault would likely last much longer than the physical injuries. But survival and salvation were not the same thing. The criminals had escaped with money and jewelry that represented months of savings, leaving behind a family that would struggle to recover from both the financial and emotional impact of the attack. The little girl would grow up with the knowledge that the world contained people who would hurt her mother for money, and that sometimes there was no one coming to help. Miles carried this knowledge like a stone in his chest, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day as he realized the true cost of his inaction. Peter Parker had died trying to save a city that included Miles among its population. Miles, in turn, had allowed innocence to suffer rather than risk the comfortable anonymity that his powers made possible. The memorial service for Spider-Man drew hundreds of thousands of people to Central Park, a gathering that resembled both funeral and festival, as New York said goodbye to its most beloved protector. Miles attended with his family, standing in the crowd of mourners, as speaker after speaker tried to capture the essence of a hero whose impact could not be measured in words. But it was the final speaker who changed everything. A middle-aged man who walked to the podium with the careful gait of someone carrying invisible wounds, his face bearing the kind of deep lines that come from years of worry and responsibility. "My name is Ben Parker," the man said, his voice carrying clearly through the park's sound system. "Peter was my nephew." The crowd fell silent, with the reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces, thousands of people holding their collective breath, as Peter Parker's uncle prepared to speak about a young man whose death had left a hole in the world that seemed too large to ever be filled. "Peter used to tell me that with great power comes great responsibility," Ben Parker continued, his words falling into the silence like seeds into fertile ground. "I never fully understood what he meant until I watched him live those words every day, until I saw how that responsibility shaped him from a frightened teenager into the man who gave his life to protect a city full of strangers." Miles felt each word like a physical blow. Ben Parker's speech becoming an indictment of his own cowardice, disguised as a tribute to his nephew's courage. But Peter's greatest power wasn't his ability to stick to walls or swing on webs, Ben Parker said, his voice gaining strength as he neared his conclusion. His greatest power was his choice to help others, even when that choice was difficult, even when it was dangerous, even when he was afraid. That power, the power to choose heroism over safety, responsibility over comfort, that power lives in all of us. As Ben Parker's words echoed across Central Park, Miles felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement of the soul that would define the rest of his life. The guilt and fear that had paralyzed him began to transform into something else, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Peter Parker was dead, and Miles Morales could not bring him back. But the principles that had guided Spider-Man's life, the responsibility that had ultimately claimed his life, those things could survive in the choices that others made moving forward. Standing in a crowd of mourners, his family beside him and his powers humming beneath his skin like electricity waiting for direction, Miles Morales made a decision that would echo through the rest of his life and the lives of countless others he had not yet met. The next person in danger would not watch him walk away. The next cry for help would not go unanswered. Peter Parker's death had created a void in the world, but voids had a way of drawing in whatever was strong enough to fill them. Miles might not be ready to wear the title of Spider-Man, might not be worthy of the legacy that had died with Peter Parker, but he could start becoming the person who might someday deserve to carry that weight. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, between the end of Ben Parker's speech and the beginning of applause that would honor his nephew's memory, Miles Morales stopped being a boy who happened to have powers and started becoming a hero who happened to be afraid. The transformation was far from complete, but it had begun. And like all the best transformations, it started not with certainty, but with the decision to try. The costume that would herald the birth of a new Spider-Man began its existence as a Halloween clearance item, hanging forgotten on a rack in a Queens discount store, marked down to $15.99, because October had given way to November, and the world had moved on to thinking about turkeys and gratitude rather than masks and pretense. Miles stood before the mirror in his bedroom, the red and blue fabric hanging loosely on his 13-year-old frame like a prophecy that had arrived too early for its fulfillment. The costume was a cheap imitation of Spider-Man's iconic design, the kind of mass-produced tribute that comic book conventions and costume parties had made ubiquitous throughout New York. But on Miles, with his powers humming beneath the synthetic fabric like electricity waiting for direction, it felt like something approaching destiny. 2 months had passed since Peter Parker's funeral. 2 months of sleepless nights and guilt-ridden days, as Miles struggled with the weight of abilities he had never asked for and a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. The decision to honor Spider-Man's legacy had been made in a moment of emotional clarity beneath the autumn sky of Central Park, but the practical implications of that decision had proven more complex than any 13-year-old should have to navigate. The first challenge had been the costume itself. Miles understood, with the instinctive wisdom of someone who had grown up in a world where superheroes were as common as professional athletes, that the uniform was more than just clothing. It was identity, symbol, protection, and statement all woven together into something that transformed the person wearing it from individual into icon. But Peter Parker's original costume was evidence in a police investigation, secured behind official tape and legal procedures that made it as inaccessible as the moon. The various replica costumes available in stores throughout the city felt like sacrilege, cheap imitations that reduced heroism to a commodity that could be purchased for the price of a decent meal. The Halloween costume had been a compromise, a starting point that acknowledged both the practical need for concealment and the symbolic weight of the Spider-Man identity. Miles had purchased it with money saved from birthday gifts and small jobs around the neighborhood, paying cash like a criminal, buying evidence of crimes not yet committed. Standing before his bedroom mirror in the early hours of a Saturday morning, with his parents still asleep and the city beginning to stir with the quiet energy of weekend possibilities, Miles looked at his reflection and saw someone he didn't quite recognize. The costume transformed his familiar teenage proportions into something that suggested capability and purpose, the mask-hiding features that would have immediately identified him as someone's son, someone's student, someone's nephew. But transformation, Miles was learning, required more than just putting on a costume. The mirror reflected back his uncertainty as much as his appearance, showing him a boy playing dress-up in clothes that belonged to a man who had died trying to live up to their significance. The red and blue fabric felt heavy with expectation, weighted down by the knowledge that everyone who saw it would think of Peter Parker, would measure whoever wore it against a standard of heroism that had been established through years of sacrifice and selflessness. Miles flexed his hands, watching as his enhanced reflexes made the movement fluid and controlled in ways that normal teenage coordination could never achieve. The tingling sensation that had become his constant companion intensified, his spider sense responding to something his conscious mind couldn't yet identify, a recognition that the moment of decision was approaching, that the space between intention and action was about to collapse. The first patrol was a disaster, in ways that would have been comedic if they hadn't been so dangerous. Miles had chosen the Williamsburg waterfront for his inaugural venture into heroism, reasoning that the industrial landscape offered plenty of hiding places and escape routes if his inexperience led to complications. The area was known for its mix of legitimate shipping operations and less legitimate activities that flourished in the shadows cast by warehouses and loading docks. But heroism, Miles discovered, was not a matter of simply putting on a costume and waiting for crime to present itself like homework assignments. The real world operated according to schedules and patterns that had nothing to do with the dramatic timing of comic book narratives. Criminals did not announce their presence with obvious signs of villainy, and victims did not always recognize that they needed rescuing. For the first 3 hours of his patrol, Miles encountered nothing more threatening than a homeless man rummaging through a dumpster and a group of teenagers engaging in the kind of mild vandalism that constituted Saturday night entertainment for young people with too much energy and too few constructive outlets. Each potential intervention presented ethical questions that superhero comics had never adequately addressed. Was property damage a crime that justified physical confrontation? Did minor drug use warrant the attention of someone with potentially lethal abilities? Where was the line between law enforcement and vigilantism? And what gave a 13-year-old the right to make those distinctions? The wall-crawling abilities that had seemed so natural in the controlled environment of his bedroom proved treacherous when applied to real-world architecture. Miles found himself slipping from window ledges that were slick with November moisture, misjudging distances between buildings that looked navigable from ground level but revealed themselves to be deadly chasms when viewed from 30 feet above the pavement. His first attempt at web-swinging using a rope he had fashioned from climbing equipment purchased at a sporting goods store nearly ended in catastrophe when the improvised web line snapped under his weight, sending him tumbling toward a concrete loading dock with only his enhanced reflexes and a desperate application of his adhesive abilities, saving him from injury that would have been difficult to explain to his parents. But it was the encounter with the kangaroo that transformed Miles's amateur heroics from embarrassing failure into genuine education in the complexities of superhuman conflict. The kangaroo, real name Frank Oliver, was exactly the kind of costumed criminal that New York had produced in abundance, since the emergence of superhuman abilities had created new categories of both hero and villain. His powers were straightforward and somewhat absurd: enhanced leg strength that allowed him to leap incredible distances, reinforced bones that could withstand the impact of his landings, and the kind of single-minded criminal ambition that made him dangerous despite his seemingly ridiculous motif. Miles discovered him in the process of robbing a shipping container filled with electronic equipment, the kangaroo's powerful legs allowing him to vault over security fences and bound between stacks of cargo with the fluid grace of his namesake. The crime was exactly the kind of clear-cut villainy that Miles had been hoping to encounter: obvious wrongdoing perpetrated by someone who was clearly operating outside the law. What followed was a confrontation that revealed the vast gulf between having superhuman abilities and knowing how to use them effectively. Miles's first attack was a disaster of overconfidence and poor planning. He dropped from the warehouse ceiling with the intention of subduing the kangaroo with a combination of surprise and his venom blast, but his inexperience with combat led him to telegraph his approach so obviously that even a criminal with kangaroo-themed powers was able to dodge with ease. The kangaroo's counterattack was swift and educational. His powerful legs launched him across the warehouse floor like a biological missile, his reinforced skull connecting with Miles's solar plexus with enough force to send the teenage hero sliding across the concrete floor in a tangle of red and blue fabric and wounded pride. "Another Spider-Man wannabe," the kangaroo sneered, his voice carrying the kind of professional disdain that experienced criminals reserved for amateur competition. "When are you kids gonna learn that playing dress-up doesn't make you heroes?" Miles struggled to his feet, his enhanced durability preventing serious injury but doing nothing to ease the sting of humiliation. The kangaroo was right. He was playing dress-up, attempting to fill a role that required years of experience and training with nothing but good intentions and untested abilities. But good intentions, Miles discovered, could sometimes be enough to start building something more substantial. The fight that followed was less a battle between hero and villain than a crash course in applied superhuman physics. Miles learned that invisibility was most effective when used strategically, rather than as a panic response, that his venom blast required close contact to be truly effective, and that even enhanced reflexes were useless without the experience to anticipate what opponents might do with their own abilities. The kangaroo's jumping ability made him a difficult target, but it also made his movements predictable once Miles began to understand the physics involved. Each leap required preparation, creating brief moments of vulnerability when the criminal was committed to a trajectory he couldn't easily alter. Miles began to time his attacks to coincide with these moments, using his wall-crawling abilities to position himself where the kangaroo couldn't easily reach him. The decisive moment came when Miles managed to web one of the kangaroo's feet to a concrete pillar mid-leap, the improvised restraint sending the criminal tumbling to the warehouse floor with bone-jarring impact. A carefully applied venom blast left Frank Oliver unconscious but unharmed, his body radiating the bioelectric signature that marked him as subdued rather than seriously injured. Miles stood over his defeated opponent, his chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline, the cheap Halloween costume torn in several places but still recognizable as the symbol it was meant to represent. Around him, the warehouse returned to its industrial silence, broken only by the distant sound of sirens that indicated someone had called the police about the disturbance. The victory felt hollow in ways that Miles hadn't expected. There was satisfaction in having successfully stopped a crime, in having proven that his abilities could be used to protect others, but there was also an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. The fight had taken nearly 20 minutes, had caused thousands of dollars in property damage, and had left Miles exhausted and questioning whether he had the skill or judgment necessary to be an effective hero. But as he prepared to disappear into the shadows before the police arrived, Miles noticed something that would stay with him long after the bruises had healed and the torn costume had been repaired. A security guard who had been tied up during the robbery was watching him with an expression of gratitude and wonder that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. "Thank you," the man said simply, his voice carrying the kind of genuine appreciation that made all the pain and uncertainty suddenly feel worthwhile. "I thought, after Spider-Man died, I thought nobody was going to come." Miles nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to respond. He activated his camouflage and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a defeated criminal and a rescued victim, and the first concrete evidence that Miles Morales might actually have what it took to wear the mantle of Spider-Man. The next morning brought a revelation that would change everything. Ganke Lee was waiting in Miles's bedroom when he returned from his night patrol, his best friend sitting calmly on the desk chair, with the kind of patient expectancy that indicated he had been there for some time. "So," Ganke said without preamble, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just solved a particularly challenging puzzle, "when were you going to tell me you're Spider-Man?" Miles froze in his doorway, the torn Halloween costume still hidden beneath his jacket but suddenly feeling as obvious as a neon sign. His mind raced through possible explanations and denials, but Ganke's expression suggested that the time for deception had already passed. "I'm not Spider-Man," Miles said automatically, the words feeling false even as he spoke them. "Spider-Man is dead. The original Spider-Man is dead," Ganke corrected with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time thinking through the logical implications of recent events. But someone in a red and blue costume just stopped the kangaroo from robbing a warehouse in Williamsburg, and that same someone has been practicing wall crawling in this very room for the past 2 months. Miles stepped into his bedroom and closed the door behind him, his enhanced hearing confirming that his parents were still asleep and unaware of the conversation that was about to reshape the foundation of his secret identity. Ganke's analytical mind had always been both blessing and curse in their friendship, but this was the first time it had been turned toward uncovering truths that Miles desperately needed to keep hidden. "How did you know?" Miles asked, abandoning pretense in favor of damage control. "You've been different since the spider bite," Ganke replied matter-of-factly, as if discussing superhuman transformation was a normal part of teenage conversation. "More coordinated, stronger, faster reflexes. Plus, there was that whole thing with the water bottle in the cafeteria, and I've seen you sticking to walls when you think nobody's looking." Miles sank onto his bed, the weight of secrecy suddenly lifting from his shoulders even as the weight of shared responsibility settled into its place. Ganke's knowledge of his abilities changed everything. No longer was he carrying this burden alone, but he was also no longer in complete control of who knew his secret. "You can't tell anyone," Miles said, his voice carrying the desperate urgency of someone whose entire future depended on discretion. "Obviously," Genki replied with the slightly offended tone of someone whose loyalty had been questioned unnecessarily. "But you also can't keep doing this alone. You need someone watching your back, someone who can help you figure out how to actually be a superhero instead of just someone with superpowers who occasionally gets lucky." The partnership that emerged from that conversation would become one of the defining relationships of Miles's heroic career. Genki approached the logistics of superheroics with the same methodical enthusiasm he brought to video game strategy guides and comic book continuity debates. Within a week, he had compiled detailed analyses of Spider-Man's known techniques, created training schedules designed to help Miles develop his abilities systematically, and begun researching the materials and methods that would be necessary to create a proper costume. But more than tactical support, Genki provided something even more valuable: the grounding influence of someone who knew Miles Morales, the person rather than Spider-Man, the symbol. In Genki's presence, Miles could express doubts and fears without worrying about undermining the confidence that heroism required. He could admit mistakes without feeling like he was betraying the legacy he was attempting to honor. The weeks that followed the kangaroo incident were a whirlwind of training, experimentation, and gradually increasing confidence. Miles learned to web swing using properly manufactured equipment that Genki had somehow acquired through internet channels that he declined to specify. He practiced combat techniques against imaginary opponents in abandoned buildings, developing the muscle memory that would allow his enhanced reflexes to function effectively under pressure. Most importantly, he began to develop the judgment that separated effective heroism from well-intentioned vigilantism. Not every crime required superhuman intervention. Not every problem could be solved with force. Not every person who appeared to be in danger actually needed rescuing. But some did, and Miles began to understand that his role was not to solve every injustice in New York, but to be present for those moments when ordinary people faced extraordinary threats that required extraordinary responses. The public reaction to reports of a new Spider-Man was mixed and complicated, reflecting the complex emotions that Peter Parker's death had stirred throughout the city. Some saw Miles's emergence as a hopeful sign that the spirit of heroism would continue even after its most visible champion had fallen. Others viewed it as disrespectful appropriation of a symbol that should have been retired along with the man who had given it meaning. The media coverage was skeptical at best, with most outlets treating reports of Spider-Man sightings as either hoaxes or the desperate wish fulfillment of a city that wasn't ready to accept that its protector was truly gone. The costume helped with the confusion from a distance, especially in poor lighting conditions. The red and blue outfit made it possible for witnesses to mistake Miles for Peter Parker, creating just enough ambiguity to keep his secret identity safe, while building the foundation for his eventual acceptance as Spider-Man's legitimate successor. But acceptance would come slowly, earned through actions rather than announced through press conferences. For now, Miles was content to learn, to grow, to become worthy of the costume he wore and the responsibility it represented. Standing once again before his bedroom mirror, this time wearing a costume that had been repaired and reinforced rather than purchased from a clearance rack, Miles saw someone different from the uncertain boy who had first put on the red and blue fabric months earlier. The face behind the mask was still young, still learning, still afraid of making mistakes that could cost lives. But it was also determined, committed to becoming something more than just a teenager with unusual abilities. Miles Morales was becoming Spider-Man, one small act of heroism at a time, one saved life at a time, one choice to help rather than hide at a time. The transformation was far from complete, but it had begun in earnest. And like all the best transformations, it was built not on the certainty of success, but on the determination to keep trying until success became inevitable. The revelation came not with dramatic flourish or calculated timing, but with the mundane casualness of a family dinner, where conversation wandered into territories that should have remained unexplored. Aaron Davis sat across from Miles at the small kitchen table, his movements carrying the unconscious precision of someone who had spent years learning to navigate through darkness without making sound, and spoke words that would shatter the comfortable illusion that heroism and family could exist in separate, uncomplicated spheres. "I've been hearing stories about a new Spider-Man," Aaron said, his voice carrying the deceptive lightness of someone testing the weight of dangerous information. Kid in a red and blue costume, stopping crimes throughout Brooklyn. Got me thinking about responsibility and family and the things we do to protect the people we love. Miles felt his enhanced senses spike with sudden alertness, every instinct that had been developing over months of superhuman activity, screaming that this conversation was heading toward revelation that would change everything. Across the table, his uncle's eyes held the kind of knowing intelligence that suggested he was aware of much more than his casual words revealed. But it was what happened next that transformed suspicion into devastating certainty. Aaron reached into his jacket and withdrew a device that Miles recognized, with the sick certainty of a dreamer, realizing that his worst nightmare was becoming reality. The gauntlet was sleek and purple, its surface covered with technological modifications that spoke to both advanced engineering and intimate familiarity with the kind of equipment that supervillains use to level the playing field against enhanced opponents. "You know what this is, don't you, nephew?" Aaron asked, his voice now carrying an edge that Miles had never heard before, a hardness that suggested depths of experience with violence and moral compromise that had been carefully hidden beneath years of avuncular affection. Miles did know what it was. He had seen similar technology in news footage of superhuman conflicts, had studied the design principles in online databases that Genki had found during their research into proper heroic equipment. It was a PROWLER gauntlet, the signature weapon of a criminal whose activities had been documented, but whose identity had remained mysterious throughout months of police investigation. "Uncle Aaron," Miles whispered, his voice breaking on words that felt too heavy for his teenage throat to carry. "Tell me you're not." "The PROWLER," Aaron finished, his confirmation delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather or weekend plans. "Yeah, Miles, I'm the PROWLER. Have been for about 3 years now. Ever since your father got his life together and left me to figure out my own way of making ends meet, in a world that doesn't have much patience for men with criminal records and limited legitimate opportunities." The kitchen around them seemed to contract, the familiar space of family meals and homework assistance, transforming into a stage for revelations that would redefine every assumption Miles had made about the adults who shaped his world. Aaron Davis, the uncle who had taught him to ride a bicycle and helped him with science projects and provided the kind of male mentorship that complemented his father's more structured guidance, was a career criminal whose activities had brought him into direct conflict with the very concept of justice that Miles was attempting to uphold. But the revelation was more complex than simple villainy, threaded through with motivations that spoke to the economic realities that had shaped Aaron's choices long before Miles had been born. The Prowler's crimes were carefully selected, targeting corporate entities and criminal organizations rather than individual victims, operating according to a code of ethics that attempted to minimize harm while maximizing the redistribution of resources from those who had too much to those who had too little. "I know what you're thinking," Aaron continued, his words cutting through Miles's stunned silence with surgical precision. "Your uncle's a criminal, a bad guy, someone you should probably turn in to the authorities. But the world isn't that simple, Miles. Sometimes being good means breaking bad laws. Sometimes protecting your family means operating outside systems that were never designed to protect people like us." Miles struggled to process information that challenged every moral framework he had been developing during his time as Spider-Man. The Prowler's activities weren't motivated by greed or sadism, but by a pragmatic understanding of economic inequality that resonated with Miles' own observations about the distribution of power and resources throughout New York. Aaron was stealing from corporations that paid their executives millions while laying off workers, from criminal organizations that profited from human misery, from systems that perpetuated injustice through legal means. But stealing was still stealing, regardless of the righteousness of the motivation or the worthiness of the target. The law existed to create boundaries that protected everyone, and those boundaries lost their meaning when individuals decided they had the right to determine which rules applied to them and which could be safely ignored. "Why are you telling me this?" Miles asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he grappled with implications that extended far beyond his own secret identity. "Because I know who you are," Aaron replied, his words delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had been accumulating evidence for weeks rather than making sudden deductions. "I know about the spider bite, about the powers you've been developing, about the costume you've been wearing when you think nobody's watching, and I know that you're trying to figure out how to be a hero in a world that makes heroism complicated." The admission hung in the air between them, like a bridge that, once crossed, would change the nature of their relationship forever. Miles realized with growing horror that his secret identity had been compromised not by investigative journalism or police work, but by the careful observation of someone who loved him enough to pay attention to details that others might miss. "I've been watching you, nephew," Aaron continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had been planning this conversation for some time. "Watching you struggle with powers you never asked for, watching you try to live up to a legacy that got a 17-year-old kid killed. And I've been thinking that maybe there's a way for us to work together, to combine your abilities with my experience and resources." The proposal that followed was seductive in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Aaron outlined a partnership that would allow Miles to continue his heroic activities, while providing him with the kind of advanced equipment and tactical support that could make the difference between success and failure in superhuman conflicts. The Prowler's technological resources, accumulated through years of carefully planned heists, could be repurposed to serve heroic ends. Aaron's knowledge of criminal networks and corporate vulnerabilities could help Miles target his efforts more effectively. All it would require was a willingness to operate outside the law when the law proved inadequate to address genuine injustices. "Think about it," Aaron urged, his words carrying the weight of someone who had spent years navigating the gray areas between heroism and criminality. Spider-Man tried to work within the system, tried to be the kind of hero that everyone could approve of. And where did it get him? Dead at 17. His life cut short because he was too noble to use the kind of tactics that might have kept him alive. Miles felt the seductive pull of his uncle's logic, the appeal of a path that would allow him to continue being a hero, while avoiding some of the ethical complications that had paralyzed him during his early attempts at crime fighting. Aaron was offering resources, experience, and family support in exchange for a willingness to blur the lines between justice and revenge, between heroism and vigilantism, but he was also offering something more dangerous: the gradual erosion of the principles that separated heroes from criminals, the slow compromise that would eventually transform well-intentioned collaboration into something that Peter Parker would never have recognized as carrying on his legacy. The first job that Aaron proposed seemed harmless enough reconnaissance on a shipment of experimental weapons that was being transported through Brooklyn by a subsidiary of Oscorp Industries. The weapons were destined for sale to overseas clients whose human rights records made their acquisition of advanced military technology a genuine threat to innocent people. Stopping the shipment would prevent those weapons from being used to commit atrocities while simultaneously striking a blow against corporate profiteering from human suffering. Miles found himself agreeing to the mission despite every instinct that warned him he was making a mistake that would have consequences extending far beyond a single night's work. The rationalization came easily. This was exactly the kind of mission that Spider-Man might have undertaken, the kind of proactive heroism that prevented crimes, rather than simply responding to them after victims had already been hurt. But rationalization, Miles would learn, was the first step down a path that led away from heroism and towards something much more complicated and dangerous. The mission itself was executed with professional precision that spoke to Aaron's years of experience in planning and conducting criminal operations. The Prowler's equipment transformed Miles' natural abilities into something approaching supernatural effectiveness. Advanced camouflage technology, making his invisibility perfect rather than merely impressive. Enhanced web shooters, allowing him to move through the urban environment with fluid grace that rivaled anything Peter Parker had ever achieved. Working alongside his uncle, Miles felt more capable and confident than he had since first putting on the Spider-Man costume. Aaron's tactical guidance helped him avoid the mistakes that had marked his early solo efforts, while the Prowler's technology eliminated many of the equipment limitations that had forced Miles to improvise solutions to problems that required specialized tools. The weapons shipment was intercepted without violence. The experimental technology disappeared into untraceable channels that would ensure it never reached its intended recipients, and Miles returned home with the satisfaction of having prevented genuine harm while operating at a level of effectiveness that felt appropriate to his superhuman abilities. But success bred appetite for more complex operations, and Aaron's proposals gradually escalated in scope and moral ambiguity. Corporate executives who profited from environmental destruction found their personal assets mysteriously redistributed to organizations working to repair ecological damage. Criminal organizations discovered that their carefully laundered profits had been donated anonymously to victim assistance programs. Politicians whose campaigns were funded by special interests learned that their private communications had been leaked to journalists whose investigations exposed corruption that would have otherwise remained hidden. Each operation was justified by its results. Each theft or assault or invasion of privacy rationalized by the good that it accomplished. Miles found himself becoming more comfortable with tactics that he would have found abhorrent months earlier. His moral compass gradually adjusting to accommodate the pragmatic necessities of effective crime fighting in a world where the legal system was often inadequate to address genuine injustices. But the true cost of his collaboration with Aaron became apparent during what should have been a routine operation against a drug distribution network that was targeting middle school students throughout Brooklyn. The mission parameters were clear: gather intelligence on the operation's leadership, identify their sources and distribution methods, and provide that information to law enforcement agencies that could dismantle the network through legal means. What actually happened was something much darker and more personal. The drug operation was being run by Marcus Santiago, a man whose criminal enterprise had grown from petty theft to major narcotics distribution through a combination of violent intimidation and strategic corruption of local officials. Santiago's operation was particularly insidious because it specifically targeted children, using peer pressure and economic desperation to create addicts who would become lifelong customers. Aaron's intelligence indicated that Santiago was planning to expand his operation into the Visions Academy area, making him a direct threat to Miles's classmates and the community that had become his responsibility to protect. The mission was personal in ways that went beyond abstract concepts of justice. This was about protecting people Miles cared about from a predator who would destroy their lives for profit. But when they confronted Santiago in the warehouse that served as his distribution center, Aaron's response to the drug dealer's threats revealed a side of the Prowler that Miles had never seen before. The violence was swift and efficient, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had crossed lines that Miles was only beginning to approach. Santiago's screams echoed through the warehouse as Aaron's equipment delivered precisely calibrated jolts of electrical energy, enough to cause excruciating pain without permanent physical damage. The interrogation that followed extracted information about suppliers and distributors, financial networks and corruption schemes, all of it obtained through methods that law enforcement agencies were legally prohibited from using. "This is how the real world works, nephew," Aaron said afterward, his voice carrying no trace of apology or regret. "Sometimes protecting innocent people requires doing things that innocent people can't do themselves. Sometimes being a hero means being willing to become something that heroes aren't supposed to be." Miles watched Santiago writhe on the warehouse floor, conscious but incapacitated, and realized that he had crossed a line that separated heroism from something much more complicated and dangerous. The information they had obtained would undoubtedly save lives, would prevent countless children from being introduced to substances that would destroy their futures. But the methods used to obtain that information were indistinguishable from torture, regardless of how carefully they had been calibrated to avoid permanent injury. The partnership with Aaron continued for several more weeks, each operation pushing the boundaries of acceptable behavior a little further, each success making it easier to rationalize the next moral compromise. Miles found himself becoming someone he didn't entirely recognize, more effective as a crime fighter, but less certain about the principles that should guide his actions, more capable of protecting others, but less able to protect his own integrity. The end came not with dramatic confrontation or philosophical awakening, but with the quiet realization that he had become complicit in activities that Peter Parker would never have condoned, that the legacy he was attempting to honor had been corrupted by his willingness to accept that good ends could justify any means. The breaking point was a mission that Aaron described as a simple intelligence-gathering operation, but which revealed itself to be something much more personal and dangerous. The target was a police detective who had been investigating the Prowler's activities, a woman whose dedication to justice threatened to expose the network of corruption and violence that Aaron had built over years of criminal operations. "She's getting too close," Aaron explained, his words carrying the cold calculation of someone who had learned to view other people's lives as variables in equations that could be solved through violence. "We need to convince her to redirect her attention toward targets that are less problematic." Miles realized with horror that Aaron was proposing to threaten a police officer whose only crime was doing her job effectively, to use intimidation and the implied threat of violence to protect criminal activities that Miles had convinced himself were somehow different from ordinary criminal enterprises because they were motivated by principles rather than pure greed. "No," Miles said, the word emerging from his throat with the finality of a door slamming shut. "I won't be part of threatening innocent people. I won't be part of protecting criminal activities from legitimate law enforcement." Aaron's response revealed the true nature of their relationship with a clarity that Miles had been avoiding for weeks. The uncle who had taught him to ride a bicycle and helped him with homework was gone, replaced by a criminal who viewed Miles not as family to be protected, but as an asset to be controlled. "You don't get to walk away, nephew," Aaron said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had made the Prowler a figure of fear throughout Brooklyn's criminal underworld. "You know too much about my operations, have too much information about activities that could put me in prison for the rest of my life. Either you continue working with me, or you become a problem that needs to be solved." The threat was delivered with the casual precision of someone who had made similar calculations countless times before, but Miles heard something else beneath the words, a note of genuine regret that suggested Aaron understood exactly what he was destroying with his ultimatum. The confrontation that followed was brief and devastating. Uncle against nephew in a battle that combined superhuman abilities with advanced technology and the kind of emotional stakes that transformed physical conflict into something approaching tragedy. Aaron's experience and equipment gave him initial advantages, but Miles' powers had been growing stronger through months of use, and his emotional state lent a desperate edge to his fighting that the Prowler hadn't anticipated. The decisive moment came when Miles managed to deliver a venom blast that overloaded Aaron's technological systems, leaving him vulnerable to the kind of direct physical confrontation that favored youth and enhanced abilities over experience and preparation. But victory in battle was not the same thing as victory in war, and Miles found himself standing over his uncle's defeated form with the terrible knowledge that winning had cost him something that could never be recovered. Aaron Davis died not from his injuries, but from the kind of deep despair that comes from realizing that all the justifications and rationalizations in the world cannot change the fundamental nature of the choices a person has made. He died knowing that he had tried to corrupt the nephew he loved, had attempted to transform a potential hero into something that would have betrayed everything Peter Parker had died trying to protect. "I'm sorry, Miles," Aaron whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of sirens approaching the warehouse where their final confrontation had taken place. "I wanted to protect you from a world that would hurt you for trying to be good. Instead, I became part of that world myself." Miles knelt beside his uncle's still form, his superhuman hearing confirming what his heart already knew, that Aaron Davis was gone, that the man who had been both family and criminal mentor had paid the ultimate price for choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had led inexorably toward this moment of tragic resolution. The police would find Marcus Santiago still unconscious in the warehouse, along with evidence of drug distribution activities that would lead to arrests throughout the narcotics network that had been targeting children. They would find the Prowler's equipment, but not the Prowler himself, the purple costume having been destroyed by the electrical overload that had ended Aaron's criminal career. What they would not find was any evidence that Spider-Man had been present, that a 13-year-old boy had just learned the hardest lesson about heroism, that good intentions were not enough to protect the people you loved from the consequences of the choices they made, that sometimes the greatest act of heroism was accepting responsibility for failures you couldn't prevent. Miles Morales left that warehouse carrying burdens that no teenager should have to bear: the weight of his uncle's death, the knowledge of how easily good intentions could be corrupted into criminal activities, and the understanding that true heroism required more than just the willingness to help others. It required the strength to maintain principles, even when those principles made effective action more difficult, even when compromise seemed like the practical solution to impossible problems. The boy who had entered that warehouse was still learning what it meant to be Spider-Man. The young man who left it understood that some lessons could only be learned through loss, that some knowledge could only be gained by paying prices that seemed too high until the moment when paying them became the only way to remain worthy of the costume he wore. Aaron Davis was dead, but the principles he had tried to corrupt lived on in the nephew who had chosen heroism over expedience, justice over revenge, integrity over effectiveness. Miles Morales was becoming Spider-Man not because he had gained the power to help others, but because he had learned to accept the responsibility that came with that power, regardless of how heavy that responsibility might prove to be. The helicarrier cast its shadow over the Hudson River like a metallic thundercloud, its presence above the New York skyline, a reminder that some conversations required settings that existed outside the normal boundaries of civilian life. Miles stood on the observation deck of the floating fortress, his Spider-Man costume feeling inadequate against the backdrop of technology that represented the full weight of international intelligence apparatus, turned toward the evaluation of a single 13-year-old boy. Nick Fury emerged from the command center, with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent decades learning to project authority through body language alone, his presence transforming the observation deck from neutral meeting space into interrogation chamber. The eye patch that had become his signature carried with it stories of conflicts that extended far beyond the scope of local crime fighting, while his bearing suggested someone who had made life-and-death decisions about superhuman individuals since before Miles had been born. "So," Fury said without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of measured skepticism that came from years of evaluating people who claimed to be heroes, "You're the kid who thinks he can fill Peter Parker's web shooters." Miles felt his spider sense tingle with warning that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with the recognition that this conversation would determine whether his attempts at heroism would be supported by the world's premier superhuman protection agency, or classified as dangerous vigilantism that needed to be contained. The months following Aaron's death had been a whirlwind of solo operations and gradually building public recognition. But this meeting represented the first official acknowledgement that his activities had risen to the level of international attention. "I'm not trying to replace Spider-Man," Miles replied carefully, his voice modulated to project confidence without suggesting arrogance. "I'm trying to honor what he stood for, to continue protecting people who need protection." Fury's laugh was sharp and humorless, the sound of someone who had heard similar declarations from countless individuals whose good intentions had proven insufficient to the actual demands of superhuman responsibility. "Kid, you want to know what Peter Parker stood for?" Fury asked, his words cutting through the wind that whipped across the helicarrier's deck with surgical precision. He stood for making the hard choices that nobody else was willing to make. He stood for accepting responsibility for problems that weren't his fault, because he had the power to do something about them. He stood for putting his life on the line every single day for people who mostly didn't know his name and wouldn't thank him if they did. The evaluation that followed was comprehensive and unforgiving. A systematic examination of every aspect of Miles's abilities and judgment that left no room for self-deception or comfortable illusions about the nature of heroism at the level that SHIELD considered operationally significant. Fury's questions probed not just what Miles could do with his powers, but how he thought about using them. Not just his tactical capabilities, but his strategic understanding of the larger conflicts that shaped the world beyond New York's borders. "Tell me about your uncle," Fury said suddenly, the words delivered with the casual precision of someone who already knew the answer but wanted to see how it would be presented. Miles felt his stomach clench with the familiar combination of grief and guilt that Aaron's memory always triggered. The knowledge that his first real test as Spider-Man had ended with the death of someone he loved, weighing on his conscience like a stone that could never be fully lifted. "Aaron Davis was the Prowler," Miles said honestly. understanding that lies would be both pointless and counterproductive when dealing with an intelligence organization that had probably investigated every aspect of his life down to his elementary school attendance records. He tried to recruit me to work with him. When I refused, he threatened me. The confrontation that followed, he died. Fury nodded, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts about a 13-year-old boy who had been forced to choose between family loyalty and moral principle, with life and death consequences riding on the decision. "And how do you feel about that?" Fury asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who understood that emotional processing was as important as tactical capabilities when evaluating potential agents. "Guilty," Miles answered without hesitation. "Responsible, like I should have found a way to save him from himself, instead of letting the situation escalate to violence. But also, resolved. He was hurting people, and I couldn't let that continue just because I loved him." The admission hung in the air between them, like a confession that revealed more about Miles's character than hours of tactical evaluation could have accomplished. Fury's single eye studied the young hero with the intensity of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs that separated those who would break under pressure from those who would find ways to carry impossible burdens without losing their essential humanity. "Peter Parker never had to kill anyone," Fury observed, his words delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing tactical specifications rather than moral watersheds. "Never had to choose between family and duty in quite the way you did. That experience either makes someone stronger or breaks them completely. Question is, which one are you?" The test that followed was designed to answer that question with the kind of definitive clarity that only extreme pressure could provide. Fury had arranged for Miles to be inserted into an ongoing SHIELD operation against Electro, the supervillain whose control over electrical energy had made him a persistent threat to New York's power infrastructure and a perfect test case for evaluating how well an untested hero would perform when faced with genuine, superhuman opposition. Maxwell Dillon had been transformed into a living electrical generator through the kind of industrial accident that seemed to plague New York with suspicious frequency, his body becoming a conduit for energies that could power a city block or reduce it to smoldering ruins, depending on his emotional state and tactical objectives. His criminal career had been marked by increasingly ambitious attacks on the infrastructure that kept 8 million people alive and functioning in one of the world's most densely populated urban environments. The intelligence indicated that Electro was planning to overload the electrical grid that powered Lower Manhattan, creating a cascading failure that would leave hospitals without power, traffic control systems offline, and emergency services operating in conditions that would make effective response nearly impossible. The attack was scheduled for the peak of evening rush hour, when maximum casualties could be achieved through the simple expedient of plunging millions of people into darkness during the most vulnerable period of their daily routines. Miles approached the mission with the kind of focused intensity that had been building in him since Aaron's death, his understanding of the stakes sharpened by months of learning that superhuman abilities came with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal satisfaction or public recognition. This was not practice or training or gradual skill development. This was a live, operational test, where failure would be measured in lives lost and a city crippled. But it was also an opportunity to prove that Peter Parker's legacy could survive in hands that were younger and less experienced, but no less committed to the principles that had defined Spider-Man's heroic career. The confrontation with Electro took place in a Con Ed substation in Lower Manhattan, the facility humming with enough electrical energy to power half the borough, while simultaneously representing a single point of failure that could collapse the entire grid if properly sabotaged. Miles arrived to find Dillon already in the process of integrating his bioelectrical signature with the power distribution systems, his body glowing with accumulated energy that turned him into a living lightning rod, capable of directing destruction with surgical precision. "Another Spider-Man," Electro snarled, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested his vocal cords had been as fundamentally altered as the rest of his physiology. "Come to die like the last one?" The battle that followed was a masterclass in applied superhuman physics. Electrical energy versus bioelectrical energy in a confrontation that pushed both combatants to the limits of their abilities, while the fate of millions of people hung in the balance. Electro's attacks came in waves that overloaded sensory systems and threatened to disrupt the neurological functions that kept Miles conscious and coordinated, while his defensive capabilities made direct physical confrontation suicidally dangerous. But Miles had learned tactical flexibility during his months of solo operations, and the lessons of his collaboration with Aaron had taught him that conventional approaches were often inadequate when facing opponents whose abilities operated outside normal parameters. Instead of engaging Electro directly, he began systematically disrupting the electrical systems that the villain was attempting to subvert, using his enhanced agility to move through the substation's infrastructure while avoiding the increasingly desperate electrical discharges that Dylan directed toward anything that moved. The decisive moment came when Miles realized that Electro's integration with the power grid had created a vulnerability that could be exploited through precisely applied bioelectrical interference. His Venom blast, when delivered through direct contact with the substation's primary transformer, created feedback loops that overloaded Dylan's ability to process and control the electrical energies he had been manipulating. The explosion that followed was controlled and surgical, designed to disable rather than destroy, to incapacitate rather than kill. Electro collapsed unconscious but alive, his body's electrical signature returning to normal human parameters, as the feedback pulse disrupted the superhuman modifications that had transformed him into a living weapon. Miles stood in the aftermath of the battle, his costume singed but his mission accomplished, the city's electrical grid stable and 8 million people unaware of how close they had come to disaster. Around him, SHIELD. Agents moved through the substation with professional efficiency, securing the scene and ensuring that Electro would be transferred to facilities designed to contain superhuman criminals. But it was Fury's reaction that mattered most. The intelligence director's evaluation of Miles's performance carrying weight that extended far beyond the specific tactical success of preventing Electro's attack. "Not bad, kid," Fury said, his voice carrying the grudging respect of someone who had seen too many promising individuals fail when faced with genuine pressure. "You kept your head, adapted to unexpected circumstances, found a solution that neutralized the threat without unnecessary casualties. That's more than a lot of experienced agents manage on their first major operation." The acknowledgement that followed was official and transformative. SHIELD's recognition of Miles Morales as the legitimate successor to Peter Parker's Spider-Man identity. The designation came with resources and support that would prove invaluable in future operations. But more importantly, it came with the understanding that his activities were no longer considered vigilantism, but official superhuman protection work sanctioned by the world's premier intelligence agency. "Welcome to the big leagues, Spider-Man," Fury said, extending his hand in a gesture that bridged the gap between evaluation and partnership. "Try not to get yourself killed before you're old enough to vote." The flight back to Brooklyn took place in a SHIELD transport that moved through the night sky with the whisper-quiet efficiency of technology that existed decades ahead of anything available to civilian applications. Miles sat in the passenger compartment, his costume replaced by civilian clothes that felt strange after hours of operating as Spider-Man, and contemplated the transformation that had just taken place in his understanding of his role in the larger world. He was no longer a teenager playing at heroism, no longer an amateur with good intentions and untested abilities. He was Spider-Man, officially recognized by the organization that coordinated superhuman protection activities worldwide, accepted as the legitimate inheritor of a legacy that had been built through years of sacrifice and service. But with recognition came responsibility on a scale that dwarfed anything he had previously experienced. SHIELD's acceptance meant that his failures would be measured not just in local terms, but as part of a global network of superhuman protection that kept the world stable in the face of threats that ordinary law enforcement could never address. The city spread out below the transport like a circuit board of light and possibility, 8 million lives going about their evening routines in buildings that glowed with electric warmth against the November darkness. Somewhere in those lights were his parents, probably wondering where their son had disappeared to for the evening, but trusting that his responsibilities as Spider-Man were important enough to justify his absence from family dinner. Somewhere in those lights was Genki, probably working on modifications to equipment that would help Miles operate more effectively in future missions, his analytical mind already processing the tactical lessons that could be learned from the confrontation with Electro. And somewhere in those lights were people whose lives had been saved by Miles' actions that evening. Commuters who would make it home safely because their subway trains had power, patients in hospitals whose life support systems would continue functioning because the electrical grid remained stable, children who would sleep soundly because the darkness that might have claimed their city had been held at bay by someone willing to stand against it. Miles Morales had become Spider-Man not through dramatic transformation or cosmic intervention, but through the accumulated weight of choices that consistently prioritized other people's welfare over his own comfort and safety. The recognition from SHIELD was official confirmation of what his actions had already demonstrated, that Peter Parker's legacy would continue in hands that were worthy of the responsibility, regardless of how young those hands might be. The city below continued its electric pulse, unaware that its newest protector had just passed the test that would define the rest of his heroic career. Miles watched the lights through the transport's window and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a mantle that he was finally ready to carry. He was Spider-Man now, officially and irrevocably. The only question was what kind of Spider-Man he would choose to become. The transformation from acknowledged hero to confident protector did not happen overnight, but unfolded through the gradual accumulation of successful missions and growing mastery over abilities that had once felt as foreign as speaking a language learned in dreams. 6 months after SHIELD's official recognition, Miles found himself moving through the urban landscape of Brooklyn with the fluid grace of someone who had finally learned to inhabit his own skin. His enhanced abilities, no longer sources of confusion and uncertainty, but tools that had been honed through practice into instruments of precision. The morning began with training that had become as routine as brushing his teeth, though infinitely more complex in its implications. Genki had converted an abandoned warehouse in Red Hook into a makeshift gymnasium where Miles could practice techniques that required superhuman abilities without fear of observation or interference. The space was equipped with obstacles and targets that challenged every aspect of his enhanced physiology, from reaction time exercises that pushed his spider sense to its limits, to strength training that took advantage of his proportionally enhanced musculature. But it was the refinement of his bioelectric abilities that marked the most significant development in Miles's evolution as Spider-Man. The Venom blast that had once been an uncontrolled discharge of nervous energy had evolved into something approaching an art form, its effects precisely calibrated to achieve specific tactical objectives rather than simply incapacitating opponents through brute electrical force. The key is understanding that it's not just about the shock, Genki explained, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had spent considerable time researching the theoretical applications of bioelectric manipulation. Your Venom blast operates on multiple levels: electrical disruption of neural pathways, electromagnetic interference with electronic systems, and psychological impact through pain association. Master those 3 elements, and you've got a weapon that can adapt to almost any situation. Miles practiced the technique on targets that Genki had rigged with sensors to measure electrical output and distribution patterns, learning to modulate the intensity and focus of his bioelectric discharge with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Low-intensity bursts could disrupt electronic surveillance systems without causing permanent damage, while maximum power applications could render even enhanced opponents unconscious without risking permanent neurological injury. The refinement extended beyond raw power to include tactical applications that took advantage of the unique properties of bioelectric energy. Miles discovered that his Venom blast could be channeled through his web lines to deliver stunning attacks at range, that it could be used to overload enemy equipment while leaving allied technology unaffected, and that it could serve as a non-lethal alternative to physical violence, in situations where excessive force might escalate conflicts unnecessarily. But technical mastery was only one component of the confidence that had been building in Miles since his official recognition by SHIELD. Equally important was the growing understanding of his place in the larger ecosystem of superhuman protection that operated throughout New York and beyond. The city had adjusted to the presence of a new Spider-Man, with the resilient adaptability that had always characterized New York's relationship with the impossible. Crime rates in Brooklyn had dropped significantly, as word spread through criminal networks that the borough was once again under the protection of someone with the ability to appear anywhere, anytime, moving through the urban environment with superhuman speed and stealth. But more than simple deterrence, Miles had begun to understand that effective heroism required building relationships with the community he was protecting, establishing trust and communication networks that allowed him to respond to problems before they escalated into crises, requiring superhuman intervention. The breakthrough had come through his partnership with Detective Maria Vasquez, a 15-year veteran of the NYPD, whose beat included the neighborhoods where Miles conducted most of his patrol activities. Initially skeptical of vigilante interference in police work, Vasquez had gradually come to appreciate the unique capabilities that Spider-Man brought to community protection efforts. "You move faster than radio calls," she had observed during one of their informal collaboration sessions. "You can get to domestic violence situations before they turn lethal. Intercept drug deals before product hits the streets. Gather intelligence in places where police presence would be counterproductive. That's not vigilantism, that's community policing with superhuman efficiency." The partnership had evolved into an informal information-sharing arrangement that allowed Miles to focus his efforts on situations where his abilities could make the most significant difference, while leaving routine law enforcement work to professionals who were better equipped to handle legal procedures and evidence collection. Vasquez provided intelligence about developing situations, while Miles provided rapid response capabilities and access to locations that conventional law enforcement couldn't safely reach. It was through this collaboration that Miles became involved in the case that would demonstrate just how far his tactical capabilities had evolved since his early amateur efforts at crime fighting. The target was Roland Treese, a mid-level criminal whose operation represented exactly the kind of community-destroying enterprise that required coordinated law enforcement response supported by superhuman capabilities. Treese specialized in recruiting teenagers from economically disadvantaged neighborhoods to serve as distributors for a synthetic drug that created temporary enhanced physical capabilities while leaving users dependent on continued access to maintain normal neurological function. The drug itself was a chemical nightmare that combined the addictive properties of traditional narcotics with the unpredictable side effects of attempting to artificially stimulate superhuman abilities in ordinary human physiology. Users experienced brief periods of enhanced strength and agility, but prolonged use led to neurological degradation that left them unable to function without chemical support. Treese's operation was particularly insidious because it specifically targeted young people who were already vulnerable to recruitment, using economic pressure and peer influence to create a distribution network that was extremely difficult for traditional law enforcement to penetrate. The teenage distributors were simultaneously victims and criminals, their involvement in the operation motivated by desperation rather than greed. "We've been trying to build cases against this guy for 8 months, Vasquez explained during a meeting on a Red Hook rooftop that had become their unofficial coordination point. "Every time we get close to arresting him, the distribution network adapts. New kids replace the ones we arrest. New locations replace the ones we shut down. He's like a cancer that metastasizes faster than we can cut it out." Miles studied the intelligence that Vasquez had compiled, surveillance photos and organizational charts that revealed the scope and complexity of Treese's operation. The criminal had built a sophisticated enterprise that took advantage of legal loopholes and police procedure limitations, operating just outside the boundaries of what conventional law enforcement could effectively address. But conventional law enforcement didn't have the ability to move through three-dimensional space at superhuman speed, to gather intelligence through surveillance methods that were impossible to detect, or to coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple locations through the kind of mobility that only web swinging could provide. "Give me 3 days," Miles said. his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to trust his abilities and judgment equally. "I'll map their entire operation, identify their sources and storage locations, and create opportunities for coordinated arrests that will shut down the network faster than they can adapt." The operation that followed was a masterpiece of applied superhuman tactics. Miles using his camouflage abilities to conduct surveillance that would have been impossible for human agents, while his enhanced mobility allowed him to track product movement through distribution channels that spanned multiple boroughs. His Venom blast provided a non-lethal method for incapacitating guards and lookouts, while his web shooters allowed him to create evidence trails that connected disparate elements of Treece's operation into a coherent pattern that prosecutors could use to build comprehensive cases. But the true demonstration of Miles' evolution as a hero came during the final coordinated assault on Treece's primary laboratory, a converted warehouse in Queens, where the synthetic enhancement drugs were manufactured using equipment stolen from legitimate pharmaceutical companies. The facility was protected by security measures that combined traditional criminal paranoia with enhanced individual countermeasures. Recognition that Treece's operation had grown large enough to attract attention from superhuman law enforcement. Electrical barriers, motion detectors, and armed guards created multiple layers of defense that would have been challenging for even experienced superheroes to penetrate without triggering alarms that would allow evidence to be destroyed before arrests could be made. Miles approached the problem with the systematic methodology that Genki had helped him develop, treating the security systems as puzzles to be solved, rather than obstacles to be overcome through brute force. His camouflage abilities allowed him to move through the facility's perimeter undetected, while carefully applied venom blasts disabled electronic systems without creating obvious signs of sabotage. The infiltration took 43 minutes of careful movement and precise electrical manipulation, Miles moving through the warehouse like a ghost whose presence could only be detected through the gradual failure of security systems that appeared to be suffering from routine technical malfunctions rather than coordinated attack. When he finally confronted Treece in the laboratory's central manufacturing area, Miles felt the satisfaction of someone who had learned to apply his abilities with surgical precision, rather than overwhelming force. "Roland Treece," he announced, his voice carrying the authority that came from months of successful operations and official recognition. "You're under arrest for manufacturing and distributing controlled substances, conspiracy to commit chemical endangerment, and about 15 other charges that Detective Vasquez will be happy to explain to you." Treece's response was swift and violent. The criminal reaching for a weapon that would have been effective against ordinary law enforcement, but proved inadequate against someone with enhanced reflexes and bioelectric abilities. Miles' Venom blast disabled both the weapon and its wielder, with a precisely calibrated discharge that left Treece conscious but incapacitated, aware enough to understand what was happening but unable to resist, arrest, or destroy evidence. The raid that followed netted not just Treece but 17 members of his distribution network, along with enough evidence to prosecute cases that would dismantle the synthetic enhancement operation permanently. More importantly, the operation demonstrated a level of coordination between superhuman and conventional law enforcement that established new standards for community protection in an era when traditional approaches were increasingly inadequate to address enhanced criminal enterprises. 23 kids are going into treatment programs instead of juvenile detention, Vasquez observed, as they watched the last of the arrested criminals being loaded into police transports. 12 families are getting their teenagers back instead of burying them. That's not just good police work, that's superhuman community service. Miles felt the comment settle into his consciousness, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The recognition that his role as Spider-Man had evolved beyond individual heroics into something approaching civic institution. He was no longer just someone who happened to have powers and chose to use them responsibly. He was part of the infrastructure that kept his community safe, a component of the social systems that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. The public response to his activities had shifted as well, from skepticism and curiosity to something approaching genuine appreciation. News coverage of Spider-Man's activities had become routine rather than sensational, reported with the matter-of-fact tone usually reserved for municipal services and public utilities. He was no longer news because he was unusual. He was news because he was effective. But perhaps the most significant indicator of Miles' growing confidence was the ease with which he had begun to balance his superhuman responsibilities with the ordinary demands of teenage life. His grades remained excellent despite the time required for patrol activities. His relationship with his parents had stabilized around a pattern of necessary secrecy that felt sustainable rather than destructive, and his friendship with Genki had evolved into a partnership that made both of them more effective in their respective roles. "You know what the difference is between you now and you 6 months ago?" Genki asked one evening as they reviewed intelligence reports and planned patrol routes for the upcoming week. "Better costume?" Miles suggested, gesturing toward the reinforced Spider-Man suit that SHIELD. Resources had allowed him to upgrade from the Halloween clearance original. "Better confidence," Genki corrected. "6 months ago, you were trying to figure out if you deserved to wear the costume. Now you know you've earned the right to define what wearing it means." Miles considered the observation as he prepared for another night of patrol, his movements through the equipment check and costume change reflecting the muscle memory of someone who had performed these rituals hundreds of times. Genki was right. Somewhere in the accumulation of successful missions and official recognition, he had stopped trying to live up to Peter Parker's legacy and started building his own. The city spread out before him as he swung through the Brooklyn evening. 8 million lights representing 8 million people whose safety was his responsibility, not because he had inherited it from someone else, but because he had chosen to accept it as his own. The weight of that responsibility no longer felt overwhelming. It felt appropriate, proportional to abilities that had been refined through practice into tools capable of protecting an entire community. Miles Morales was Spider-Man, not because SHIELD had recognized him, or because Peter Parker had died leaving a void to be filled, but because he had become someone worthy of the responsibility that came with the name. The transformation was complete, not in the sense of being finished, but in the sense of being authentic. He was no longer becoming Spider-Man. He simply was Spider-Man, with all the confidence and capability that identity required. The night ahead held its usual promise of challenges and opportunities, criminals to be stopped, and people to be protected, and problems to be solved through the application of enhanced abilities guided by principles that had been tested through months of real-world application. Miles swung toward those challenges with the fluid grace of someone who had finally learned to inhabit his own skin, his movements through the urban landscape reflecting not just superhuman ability, but superhuman purpose. He was ready for whatever the night might bring, confident in his abilities and certain of his purpose. The city was under his protection, and he was equal to that responsibility. Spider-Man was home. The sky above New York began to burn at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other day in the Ultimate Universe. With commuters navigating subway delays and students enduring afternoon classes, and heroes responding to the routine crises that kept a city of 8 million people functioning despite the constant threat of superhuman chaos. But the cosmic fire that suddenly painted the heavens in shades of destruction was anything but routine. It was the herald of Galactus, the devourer of worlds, and it announced that Earth 1610 had approximately 6 hours left to exist. Miles felt the change before he saw it, his spider sense erupting into a symphony of warning that transcended anything he had previously experienced. The tingling sensation that usually preceded danger became a full-body electrical storm, his enhanced nervous system screaming that something was approaching the planet that defied every category of threat he had learned to recognize. It was not criminal activity or superhuman conflict or even natural disaster. It was the kind of existential terror that came from realizing that everything you had ever known was about to be erased from reality. The first visual confirmation came through Genki's laptop, emergency broadcasts interrupting regular programming with images that challenged human comprehension. High-altitude cameras captured something vast and impossible descending through Earth's atmosphere, a figure whose proportions made the planet itself seem small by comparison. Galactus was not just large, he was cosmic, his presence warping space-time around him like a living gravitational anomaly that bent reality to accommodate his existence. Miles. Genki's voice carried the hollow quality of someone trying to process information that exceeded the boundaries of rational thought. "I think we're looking at the end of the world." The streets of Brooklyn erupted into chaos as the reality of the situation penetrated the civilian population. Traffic ground to a halt as drivers abandoned their vehicles to stare at the sky, while emergency services found themselves overwhelmed by calls reporting everything from religious experiences to complete psychological breakdowns. The city's infrastructure, designed to handle human-scale crises, proved laughably inadequate when faced with the prospect of planetary annihilation. But chaos, Miles discovered, was also opportunity. In the spaces between panic and despair, heroes found chances to make differences that might not save the world, but could save individual lives, could preserve fragments of humanity, even in the face of cosmic destruction. The evacuation of Brooklyn General Hospital became Miles's first contribution to humanity's final hours, his enhanced mobility, allowing him to coordinate rescue efforts that conventional emergency services couldn't manage under the deteriorating conditions. Patients who couldn't be moved safely through normal procedures found themselves transported by webline to more secure locations, while Miles' ability to move through three-dimensional space made it possible to evacuate people from upper floors even after elevators failed and stairwells became impassable. "How many?" he asked Dr. Martinez, the attending physician who had taken charge of evacuation coordination, when the hospital's administrative structure collapsed under the weight of circumstances no disaster preparedness manual had ever contemplated. 237 patients who can't be moved without specialized transport, she replied, her voice carrying the clinical precision that medical professionals use to maintain functionality when emotion would be counterproductive. 43 who probably won't survive evacuation even with perfect conditions. 18 who definitely won't survive. Miles nodded, understanding that triage had just become a matter of life and death on a scale that made his previous crime-fighting experiences seem like preparation exercises. Every decision about who to evacuate first carried the weight of determining who would live to see whatever came after Galactus, assuming anything came after Galactus. The web-slinging that had become second nature during his months as Spider-Man took on new significance when applied to mass evacuation under apocalyptic conditions. Each person he carried to safety represented not just a successful rescue, but a small victory against the cosmic indifference that threatened to reduce 8 million individual lives to statistical irrelevance. But individual heroics, no matter how well executed, were insufficient when measured against the scope of Galactus's threat. The Devourer of Worlds was not a criminal who could be stopped through better tactics, or enhanced criminal to be defeated through superior force. He was a fundamental aspect of cosmic ecology, as natural and inevitable as entropy itself. The response from Earth's superhuman community reflected both the magnitude of the threat and the fragmented nature of heroic organization in the Ultimate Universe. The Ultimates assembled with their characteristic mixture of advanced technology and interpersonal dysfunction, their headquarters becoming a command center for coordinating global defense efforts that everyone understood were probably futile, but that had to be attempted anyway. Miles arrived at the Triskelion as part of a larger gathering that included every enhanced individual capable of contributing to planetary defense, his Spider-Man costume placing him among heroes whose names had once seemed as distant as mythology, but who now moved with the desperate urgency of people facing a problem that reduced all previous conflicts to mere practice sessions. "The situation is simple," Nick Fury announced to the assembled heroes, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to deliver impossible news with professional detachment. "Galactus is here to consume our planet's energy. He's done this to thousands of worlds across the universe. We have 6 hours to either convince him to leave or find a way to stop him." The strategic discussion that followed was both inspiring and terrifying, a demonstration of human ingenuity and courage applied to a problem that existed on a scale beyond human comprehension. Tony Stark outlined technological solutions that might theoretically disrupt Galactus's energy absorption processes, while Reed Richards explained the cosmic physics involved in planetary consumption with the clinical precision of someone describing a natural disaster that happened to involve the death of everyone on Earth. But it was the moment when the heroes turned to practical questions of evacuation and civilian protection that Miles understood his role in humanity's final hours would not be fighting Galactus directly, but ensuring that as many people as possible survived whatever came next. "We need coordination between ground-level evacuation and orbital defense," Captain America said, his voice carrying the natural authority that had made him a leader even in circumstances that had never been covered in any military training manual. "People with mobility powers need to focus on getting civilians to whatever safe zones we can establish, while heavy hitters concentrate on buying us time." Miles found himself assigned to a mixed team that included Storm from the Ultimate X-Men, whose weather manipulation abilities could create environmental conditions that facilitated mass evacuation, and several other heroes whose powers were better suited to rescue operations than direct confrontation with cosmic-level threats. The evacuation of Manhattan became a coordinated effort that showcased both the best of human cooperation and the limitations of even superhuman abilities when applied to logistical challenges of unprecedented scope. Miles's role involved moving through the city's vertical landscape, using his wall-crawling abilities to reach people trapped in high-rise buildings, while his enhanced agility allowed him to navigate through infrastructure that was beginning to fail under the gravitational stresses created by Galactus's presence. But it was during the evacuation of a midtown elementary school that Miles experienced his first direct encounter with the cosmic forces that were reshaping reality around Galactus's presence. The building's structural integrity was failing not through conventional earthquake or explosion, but through the warping of space-time itself, walls bending into impossible geometries, as the fabric of reality strained to accommodate energies that existed outside normal physical laws. Moving through the school's corridors required navigation skills that had nothing to do with his spider sense, and everything to do with learning to function in an environment where cause and effect were becoming suggestions, rather than laws. Miles found himself carrying children through hallways that folded back on themselves, climbing walls that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and timing his movements to coincide with brief moments when local physics reasserted enough stability to allow normal locomotion. "How many?" he asked Mrs. Rodriguez, the teacher who had taken charge of coordinating evacuation from her third-grade classroom. 27 students, plus 4 staff members," she replied, her voice carrying the forced calm of someone who was maintaining professional composure through sheer force of will. "Most of the building has been evacuated, but we're trapped by whatever that is." Through the classroom windows, they could see the source of the spatial distortion, a tendril of energy that extended from Galactus's form, like a cosmic root system, its presence warping reality for several city blocks in every direction. The energy was beautiful in the way that natural disasters were beautiful, possessing a terrible elegance that made it almost impossible to look away, despite the knowledge that direct observation might be fatal. Miles spent the next 47 minutes moving children through spaces that should not have existed, carrying them one at a time to safety zones that remained stable enough to support human life. Each trip required navigating through corridors that changed configuration between passages, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to adapt to gravitational fields that shifted direction without warning, and architectural layouts that redesigned themselves according to principles that had nothing to do with human engineering. The last child he evacuated was Maria Santos, a 7-year-old whose calm acceptance of the impossible circumstances around her reminded Miles that children often adapted to extraordinary situations with a flexibility that adults couldn't match. "Are you really Spider-Man?" she asked, as they moved through a hallway that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. "Yeah," Miles replied, his voice carrying the simple honesty that seemed appropriate when discussing identity with someone who was experiencing the end of the world with remarkable composure. "I'm really Spider-Man. My brother says Spider-Man died," Maria observed matter-of-factly, apparently unconcerned by the logical contradiction this presented. "The first Spider-Man died," Miles explained as they reached a window that opened onto a fire escape that led to a ground-level evacuation zone. "I'm the second one." Maria nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense, her acceptance of succession and legacy demonstrating the kind of wisdom that Miles had been struggling to understand for months. He was not Peter Parker, would never be Peter Parker, but he was Spider-Man in his own right, carrying forward principles and responsibilities that transcended any individual who chose to embody them. The larger battle against Galactus unfolded on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. Conventional military forces engaging cosmic energy manifestations, while enhanced individuals attempted to disrupt energy absorption processes that operated according to physics that human science had barely begun to understand. Miles caught glimpses of the conflict during his evacuation duties, flashes of light that occurred in spectrums beyond human vision, explosions that happened in dimensions orthogonal to normal spacetime, and energy discharges that left afterimages burned into reality itself. But the true scope of the battle only became apparent when he joined the final coordinated assault on Galactus himself, his role shifting from evacuation support to direct engagement with forces that made every previous threat he had faced seem trivial by comparison. The approach to Galactus required movement through an environment that challenged every assumption Miles had made about the nature of physical reality. The space around the Devourer of Worlds was folded and compressed, distances becoming variables that changed based on observation and intention rather than measurement. Miles found himself swinging through gravitational fields that pulled in directions that didn't exist in normal space, his web lines anchoring to surfaces that occupied multiple dimensions simultaneously. His first close-up view of Galactus was overwhelming in ways that transcended mere scale. The cosmic entity was vast beyond comprehension, but more disturbing was the recognition that he was fundamentally indifferent to the destruction he was causing. Earth's annihilation was not malicious, it was simply necessary, as natural and inevitable as a human consuming food to maintain biological functions. The assault itself was coordinated chaos, dozens of heroes applying their abilities in ways that had never been tested under conditions that existed outside the boundaries of normal reality. Tony Stark's technology interfaced with cosmic energy systems, while Reed Richards attempted to modify Galactus's absorption processes on a molecular level. Storm created weather patterns that existed in multiple dimensions, while other heroes provided cover and support for efforts that might theoretically slow or disrupt planetary consumption. Miles' contribution came through his unique combination of mobility and bioelectric abilities, his Venom blast providing a form of energy interference that could disrupt some of Galactus's more delicate energy absorption processes. Moving through the cosmic battlefield required every technique he had learned during months of urban crime fighting, but applied to navigation problems that had never been anticipated by any training regimen. The decisive moment came not through direct victory but through cosmic intervention that existed outside human agency or understanding. Reed Richards' modifications to Galactus's energy absorption systems created feedback loops that made Earth temporarily inedible, while simultaneous efforts by other heroes convinced the cosmic entity that this particular planet might not be worth the effort required to consume it. Galactus's departure was as sudden and overwhelming as his arrival, reality snapping back into normal configurations as cosmic energies withdrew from local spacetime. The sky returned to its normal blue, gravity reasserted consistent directional properties, and the city began the complex process of determining what had been destroyed, what had been saved, and what needed to be rebuilt. Miles found himself standing in what had once been Times Square, his costume torn and his body exhausted, but his mind crystal clear about what he had just experienced. He had participated in the defense of his entire universe, had contributed to saving not just New York or Earth, but the continued existence of everything he had ever known or cared about. But more than cosmic significance, the experience had taught him something fundamental about the nature of heroism at scales that transcended local crime fighting. Being Spider-Man meant being ready to face threats that ranged from petty theft to universal annihilation, to maintain hope and effectiveness regardless of the scope of the challenges that presented themselves. The city around him was damaged but intact, its 8 million residents beginning the process of returning to normal life with the resilient adaptability that had always characterized New York's response to the impossible. Emergency services were already coordinating relief efforts, while city officials attempted to assess infrastructure damage and coordinate reconstruction efforts. "Not bad for your first cosmic crisis," Nick Fury observed, appearing beside Miles with the sudden materialization that seemed to be a standard feature of high-level intelligence work. Most heroes don't survive their first encounter with forces that can destroy planets. Miles nodded. understanding that he had just passed another test in his ongoing evolution as Spider-Man, but also recognizing that cosmic threats represented a category of responsibility that he was only beginning to understand. The universe was vast and dangerous in ways that street-level crime fighting had never prepared him for, filled with entities whose casual actions could eliminate entire civilizations. But the universe was also defended by heroes who were willing to stand against impossible odds, to risk their lives protecting people they had never met from threats they barely understood. Miles Morales was now officially part of that cosmic defense network, a Spider-Man whose responsibilities extended beyond Brooklyn or New York, to include the continued existence of everything. The evening that followed Galactus's departure was both celebration and preparation, heroes gathering to assess damage and coordinate recovery efforts, while beginning the complex process of preparing for whatever cosmic threat might appear next. Miles participated in these discussions with the growing understanding that his role as Spider-Man would continue to evolve, that each crisis would teach him new aspects of responsibility that he had never anticipated. But beneath the cosmic implications and universal responsibilities, he remained a 14-year-old boy from Brooklyn who had learned to carry impossible weights with grace and determination. The experience with Galactus had not changed who he was. It had simply revealed new dimensions of who he was capable of becoming. Standing on a rooftop overlooking a city that still existed because heroes had been willing to risk everything to protect it, Miles felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settle alongside his existing commitments to neighborhood protection and family loyalty. The universe was vast and dangerous, but it was also home to people worth protecting, and he was honored to be among those who had accepted the responsibility for their safety. Spider-Man was ready for whatever came next, whether that was stopping convenience store robberies or defending reality itself from cosmic annihilation. The scale might change, but the principles remained constant. Protect those who needed protection, stand against forces that threatened the innocent, and never give up hope that even impossible situations could be resolved through courage and determination. The cosmos had tested him and found him worthy. Now all he had to do was live up to that assessment for the rest of his heroic career. The end of everything began with a sound that reality shouldn't have been able to produce: the cosmic scream of universes colliding like soap bubbles bursting in dimensions that existed beyond human perception. Miles felt it first through his spider sense, which had evolved during his months as a hero to detect threats that ranged from muggers to cosmic entities. But this sensation transcended every category of danger he had learned to recognize. It was not warning of something that might happen, but notification that existence itself was being rewritten according to rules that had never applied to anything he understood as reality. The ultimate universe, Earth 1610, the only home that Miles Morales had ever known, was dying. The technical explanation came through emergency broadcasts that interrupted regular programming with information that challenged the boundaries of human comprehension. Scientists at research facilities around the world reported identical readings. Reality was experiencing what they termed incursions, moments when alternate universes occupied the same dimensional space, creating conflicts that could only be resolved through the complete destruction of one universe or the other. "It's not natural," Reed Richards explained during an emergency briefing at the Triskelion, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who had spent his career studying the impossible, only to discover that the impossible had been conservative in its scope. "These incursions are being artificially induced, reality being manipulated by forces that exist outside our dimensional framework." Miles stood among the assembled heroes, his Spider-Man costume feeling inadequate against the backdrop of universal annihilation, and tried to process information that made Galactus seem like a local neighborhood problem. The Devourer of Worlds had threatened to destroy Earth, but at least Earth would have been destroyed by something that operated according to comprehensible physical laws. This crisis involved the systematic elimination of entire realities, the methodical erasure of universes full of people who would cease to have ever existed. But the true horror of the incursions became apparent when the first direct observation occurred over Manhattan, reality tearing open like fabric under stress, to reveal something that should not have been possible to see. Through the dimensional rift, they could observe another Earth, another New York, another universe full of people whose existence was mutually exclusive, with their own continued survival. The other Earth was different in ways that were both subtle and profound. The skyline was familiar but altered, buildings that existed in different configurations, advertisements for products that had never been invented in the ultimate universe, people whose lives had followed alternate paths through circumstances that had shaped a reality parallel to, but distinct from everything Miles had ever known. And in that other reality, looking back through the dimensional rift with equal horror and recognition, was another Spider-Man. Peter Parker of Earth 616 wore a costume that was simultaneously familiar and alien, the red and blue design carrying subtle variations that spoke to a different approach to heroic identity. But more disturbing than costume details was the recognition that passed between them, the acknowledgement that they were looking at versions of themselves that had been shaped by different choices, different circumstances, different universes that had produced different outcomes from similar starting points. "That's impossible," Miles whispered, his voice barely audible above the cosmic energies that crackled around the dimensional rift. "Not impossible," the 616 Peter Parker called across the space between realities, his voice carrying clearly despite the dimensional barriers that separated their universes. "Just complicated. And about to become tragic if we can't figure out how to prevent our realities from destroying each other." The conversation that followed took place across a dimensional divide that represented more than just physical distance. It was communication between versions of reality that could not coexist, heroes whose continued existence was mutually exclusive, but whose shared commitment to protecting innocent people created common ground that transcended the cosmic forces trying to eliminate one or both of their universes. "How many people are we talking about?" Miles asked, though he suspected the answer would be too large to meaningfully comprehend. 8 billion on my Earth, the 616, Peter replied. "Probably similar numbers in your reality. And if the incursions continue, only one of our universes gets to keep existing." The strategic discussion that followed was conducted under circumstances that had never been anticipated by any disaster preparedness protocol. How do you coordinate defense efforts with heroes from an alternate reality when meeting in person would result in the immediate destruction of both universes? How do you develop tactical plans when the enemy exists outside the boundaries of space and time as either reality understood them? But coordination proved unnecessary when the true scope of the crisis became apparent. The incursions were not random conflicts between alternate realities. They were the systematic harvesting of universes by entities called the Beyonders, cosmic beings whose existence predated and transcended the multiverse itself. Reality was being destroyed not through accident or natural disaster, but through the deliberate actions of creatures whose motivations existed beyond anything human consciousness could comprehend. The Ultimate Universe's final hours were marked by a desperate attempt to preserve something, anything, from the complete erasure that the Beyonders intended. Miles found himself working alongside heroes whose names had become legend during his brief career, but also alongside ordinary people whose courage in the face of universal annihilation demonstrated that heroism was not limited to those with enhanced abilities. The evacuation efforts were both inspiring and futile. Attempts to preserve fragments of civilization in the face of complete cosmic annihilation. Miles spent his final hours in the Ultimate Universe, doing what he had always done as Spider-Man, protecting people who needed protection, helping those who couldn't help themselves, maintaining hope in the face of impossible circumstances. But protection and help took on new meanings when the circumstances involved the end of reality itself. Every person he evacuated from a collapsing building would still cease to exist when the universe was destroyed. Every child he carried to safety would still be erased from existence, along with everyone they had ever known or loved. Every act of heroism was simultaneously meaningful and pointless, valuable because it demonstrated human courage, and worthless because it could not prevent the ultimate outcome. The moment of universal destruction was both instantaneous and eternal. Reality collapsing into itself with the finality of a door slamming shut on everything that had ever existed in the Ultimate Universe. Miles felt himself being unmade at the molecular level, his consciousness dispersing as the fundamental forces that had created his reality were systematically eliminated by cosmic entities whose existence he could not comprehend. But consciousness, it turned out, was more resilient than reality itself. Miles awoke on Battleworld, a patchwork planet constructed from fragments of destroyed universes by the cosmic entity known as the Beyonder, who had salvaged pieces of reality from the multiverse-wide destruction and assembled them into a single world that existed outside normal space-time. The landscape around him was a surreal mixture of familiar and alien geography. Sections of the Ultimate Universe's New York existing, adjacent to territories that had been harvested from realities he had never seen. The discovery that he was not alone came through encounters with other survivors, heroes and civilians who had been preserved during the universal destruction and deposited on Battleworld without explanation or apparent purpose. Some were from his own reality, faces he recognized from his time as Spider-Man, while others were clearly from alternate universes, wearing costumes and displaying abilities that were similar to but distinct from anything he had previously encountered. But the most significant encounter was with Peter Parker of Earth 616, the Spider-Man whose universe had also been destroyed in the cosmic catastrophe, but who had somehow retained clearer memories of what had happened and why they were still alive when everything they had known was gone. The Beyonder saved fragments, Peter explained, as they explored the bizarre landscape of Battleworld together, their conversation marking the first time that two Spider-Men from different realities had ever been able to interact without causing dimensional collapse. Pieces of different universes, people and places and things that he found interesting or useful or important enough to preserve when everything else was destroyed. The explanation was both comforting and terrifying. They were alive not because they had earned survival through their heroic actions, but because a cosmic entity had decided they were worth preserving for reasons that existed beyond human understanding. They were refugees from destroyed realities, living in a constructed world that operated according to rules that had been designed by something whose motivations they could not comprehend. But survival, even under incomprehensible circumstances, created opportunities for connection and mutual understanding that had never been possible when their realities were separated by dimensional barriers. Miles found himself learning from Peter Parker in ways that transcended tactical instruction or strategic guidance, gaining insights into the nature of responsibility and heroism from someone who had carried the Spider-Man identity for years longer than Miles had been alive. Being Spider-Man isn't about the costume or the powers, Peter observed during one of their conversations, his words carrying the weight of experience that had been accumulated through years of facing impossible choices and living with their consequences. It's about accepting that if you can help someone, you should help them, regardless of whether helping them is convenient or safe or likely to succeed. The philosophy resonated with Miles in ways that connected to his own journey from reluctant teenager to committed hero, but hearing it articulated by someone who had traveled a similar path provided validation and guidance that he had been seeking without realizing it. Peter Parker's experience as Spider-Man had been different from Miles in countless ways, but the fundamental principles remained constant across realities and circumstances. Their partnership on Battleworld evolved into something that transcended mentorship, becoming a collaboration between equals who brought different perspectives and abilities to shared challenges. Miles' unique powers, his camouflage abilities and venom blast complemented Peter's experience and web-slinging expertise, while their combined moral framework created a foundation for heroic action, even in circumstances that defied conventional understanding. The months they spent on Battleworld were filled with adventures that ranged from helping other survivors adapt to their strange new circumstances to confronting threats that emerged from the mixing of different realities in ways that created unprecedented dangers. But more than specific incidents, the time allowed Miles to understand what it meant to be Spider-Man at a level that went beyond technique or tactical ability. He learned that heroism was not dependent on external validation or official recognition, but on internal commitment to principles that remained constant regardless of circumstances. He learned that the responsibility to help others did not diminish when the people needing help were strangers from alternate realities, and that courage was not about fearlessness, but about acting in spite of fear when action was necessary. But perhaps most importantly, he learned that the Spider-Man identity was large enough to contain multiple people with different backgrounds and experiences. that Peter Parker's legacy was not diminished by Miles carrying it forward in his own way, and that heroism was not a finite resource that could be depleted through sharing. The resolution of the Battleworld crisis came through the intervention of Franklin Richards, a young man whose reality-warping abilities operated on a scale that made cosmic entities seem limited by comparison. Franklin's powers had been enhanced by his experiences during the multiverse's destruction, allowing him to perform feats that included the reconstruction of reality itself, according to principles that took into account the desires and needs of the people who had been displaced by cosmic catastrophe. "I can rebuild the multiverse," Franklin explained to the assembled survivors, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had grown accustomed to wielding power that transcended normal understanding. "But I can also make changes, improvements, fixes to problems that existed in the original reality structure." The opportunity to reshape reality raised questions that had never been addressed in any philosophical framework Miles had encountered. If reality could be reconstructed according to human desires rather than cosmic accident, what principles should guide those choices? If the multiverse could be redesigned to eliminate suffering and injustice, should that opportunity be taken, even if it meant fundamentally altering the nature of existence itself? But Franklin's solution was both elegant and respectful of individual choice. Rather than imposing a single vision of improved reality on everyone, he offered to reconstruct the multiverse with modifications that would allow people to choose their own destinies, to live in realities that reflected their values and desires, rather than being trapped by the circumstances of their original universes. For Miles, the choice was simultaneously simple and complex. He could return to a reconstructed ultimate universe, where his family and friends were alive, and his familiar life could continue, or he could choose to join the reconstructed Earth 616, where Peter Parker was alive and active as Spider-Man, creating opportunities for continued mentorship and collaboration that had proven valuable during their time on Battleworld. "What do you think I should do?" Miles asked Peter during their final conversation before Franklin's reality reconstruction began. "I think you should choose whatever feels right to you," Peter replied, his words carrying the wisdom of someone who understood that important decisions could not be made for other people. "But I also think that Earth 616 could use another Spider-Man, and I think you'd find ways to make a difference there that you might not be able to make anywhere else." The decision, when Miles finally made it, felt both momentous and inevitable. The Ultimate Universe had been his home, but it was also the place where his uncle had died and where his heroic journey had been marked by loss and compromise. Earth 616 represented a fresh start, a chance to be Spider-Man in a reality where Peter Parker was alive to provide guidance and support, where the mistakes of the past could be learned from without being constantly relived. Franklin's reality reconstruction was both subtle and profound. The new Earth 616, incorporating elements from multiple destroyed universes while maintaining the essential character that had made it a place where heroes could thrive. Miles found himself transported not just to a new reality, but to a new life. His memories of the Ultimate Universe intact, but his existence now firmly rooted in a world where different possibilities existed. The most remarkable aspect of the transition was the seamless way his family and friends were integrated into the new reality, their memories modified just enough to account for the differences between universes, while preserving the essential relationships that had shaped Miles's development as both person and hero. Jefferson and Rio Morales were still his parents. Ganka Lee was still his best friend. But they now existed in a reality where their son and friend was one of two active Spider-Men protecting New York. Standing on a Brooklyn rooftop, overlooking a skyline that was familiar but subtly different, Miles felt the weight of infinite possibility settling around him like a costume that had been tailored specifically for his dimensions. He was Spider-Man, in a reality where Spider-Man was alive and active, a junior partner in a heroic legacy that had room for multiple people carrying forward the same principles and responsibilities. The first patrol through his new reality was a revelation, swinging through streets that were recognizable but enhanced, past buildings that existed in slightly different configurations, over neighborhoods that had been shaped by historical events that had never occurred in the Ultimate Universe. But more than architectural differences, He could sense the presence of Peter Parker somewhere in the city, another Spider-Man whose existence created possibilities for collaboration and mutual support that had never been available in his original reality. Miles Morales had died with the Ultimate Universe and been reborn in Earth 616. His heroic journey transformed from solo responsibility to shared legacy. The multiverse had been destroyed and reconstructed, but Spider-Man endured, carried forward by people who understood that some principles transcended the boundaries of individual realities. He was home, in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with purpose. The responsibility to protect others continued in a new reality, but now it was a responsibility he would never have to carry alone. The city spread out below him, 8 million people living their lives in a reality that had been constructed from the fragments of destroyed universes. And Miles felt the familiar sense of purpose that had defined his heroic career since the moment he had decided to honor Peter Parker's legacy. Some things changed when realities were reconstructed, but the need for heroes remained constant. Spider-Man swung through the night, ready to discover what challenges and opportunities awaited him in a universe that had been built to be better than the one that had come before. The adjustment to living in a reality where Peter Parker was alive proved more complex than Miles had anticipated during those final conversations on Battleworld. When the concept of sharing the Spider-Man identity had seemed like an elegant solution to the problem of continuing a heroic legacy in a reconstructed universe, the theoretical beauty of mentorship and collaboration gave way to the practical difficulties of two people operating under the same name, in the same city, their activities inevitably intersecting in ways that created confusion for criminals, civilians, and law enforcement alike. The first indication that coexistence would require more coordination than either Spider-Man had initially realized came during what should have been a routine stop of a convenience store robbery in Queens. Miles arrived at the scene to find Peter already in action, his more experienced approach to web-slinging and criminal apprehension, making Miles' assistance seem unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. "Sorry," Miles called out as he swung away from the scene, his voice carrying the awkward uncertainty of someone who had just realized that his presence was redundant. "Didn't know you were already handling it." "No problem," Peter replied, but his response carried the distracted quality of someone who was trying to be polite, while also dealing with armed criminals and concerned bystanders. "Maybe we should talk about coordination protocols later." The conversation that followed took place on a rooftop in Midtown Manhattan, both Spider-Men perched on the edge of a building that offered panoramic views of a city that now had two protectors with identical names and nearly identical costumes. The meeting was simultaneously ordinary and unprecedented, two heroes discussing operational procedures, but also two versions of the same heroic identity learning to coexist in ways that had never been tested in any reality. "The thing is," Peter began, his words carrying the careful diplomacy of someone who was trying to address a sensitive subject without causing offense. "I've been Spider-Man in this city for about 10 years. People know me, cops know me, even the criminals know what to expect. Adding another Spider-Man to the mix is going to create confusion unless we figure out how to make it work smoothly." Miles nodded, understanding that Peter's concerns were practical rather than territorial, but also recognizing that the situation created challenges that went beyond simple logistics. How do you maintain a secret identity when there are two people using the same heroic name? How do you build public trust and law enforcement cooperation when witnesses can't be certain which Spider-Man responded to their emergency? "Maybe we need different territories," Miles suggested, though the idea felt like a retreat from the collaborative possibilities that had attracted him to Earth 616 in the first place. "You take Manhattan, I take Brooklyn. We coordinate on anything that crosses borough lines." "That could work," Peter agreed, but his tone suggested he was thinking through complications that went beyond simple geographic division. "But what happens when there's a major crisis that requires both of us? What happens when criminals start planning their activities around which Spider-Man is likely to respond? What happens when the media starts treating us like competing brands instead of partners?" The questions raised issues that neither of them had fully considered during their time on Battleworld, when the theoretical possibility of collaboration had seemed more important than the practical challenges of implementation. Sharing the Spider-Man identity in a single reality required navigation of complex social and operational dynamics that had never been tested under real-world conditions. But the solution, when it emerged, came not through formal planning but through organic adaptation to circumstances that demanded immediate response regardless of coordination protocols. The crisis began with reports of unusual seismic activity in Lower Manhattan, ground tremors that were too regular to be natural earthquakes but too localized to be conventional military or industrial activity. Both Spider-Men arrived at the scene independently, their spider senses drawing them to the same source of danger through different routes across the city. What they found was a construction site where legitimate excavation work had accidentally broken through into a subterranean facility that had been abandoned since the 1970s, when Cold War paranoia had led to the creation of emergency bunkers that were subsequently forgotten by the agencies that had built them. But the bunker was not empty. Decades of abandonment had created ideal conditions for criminal organizations to establish operations that required secrecy and security, and the accidental breach had revealed a sophisticated weapons manufacturing facility operated by a coalition of criminal enterprises that included remnants of both the Kingpin's organization and the Maggia crime families. The facility was defended by security systems that combined Cold War-era paranoia with modern criminal pragmatism, automated weapons platforms that could engage multiple targets simultaneously, while human guards coordinated responses through communication networks that had been designed to function even under conditions of electronic warfare. The criminals had been planning to relocate their operations when the construction accident occurred, but the premature exposure had transformed an orderly withdrawal into a desperate battle to prevent law enforcement from accessing evidence that could dismantle criminal networks throughout the East Coast. "Okay," Peter observed as they surveyed the tactical situation from a concealed position, overlooking the construction site. "This is definitely a two-Spider-Man problem." Miles found himself grinning despite the dangerous circumstances, the recognition that their partnership was about to be tested under conditions that would require every technique they had developed individually, while also demanding seamless coordination between their different approaches to superhuman crime fighting. "What's the plan?" Miles asked, his voice carrying the eager anticipation of someone who was about to discover whether theoretical collaboration could translate into practical effectiveness. "You take the south entrance, I'll take the north," Peter replied, his words carrying the confident precision of someone who had learned to make tactical decisions under pressure. "Your camouflage abilities will let you bypass their motion detectors, while I create enough noise and confusion to draw their attention away from your approach. We meet in the middle and work our way through their defenses systematically." The plan was elegantly simple, taking advantage of their complementary abilities while avoiding the kind of complex coordination that could break down under combat conditions. Miles' unique powers made him ideal for infiltration and surprise attacks, while Peter's experience provided the tactical knowledge necessary to predict how criminal organizations would respond to superhuman assault. Miles's approach through the facility's southern entrance was a masterpiece of applied stealth technology, his camouflage abilities rendering him completely invisible to both human observation and electronic surveillance systems. The underground complex was larger and more sophisticated than external observations had suggested, a multi-level facility that had been extensively modified to serve as both weapons manufacturing center and strategic command post for criminal operations that spanned multiple states. Moving through the facility's corridors required every infiltration technique that Miles had developed during his months as Spider-Man, but applied to an environment that had been specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of intrusion he was attempting. The criminals had invested considerable resources in security measures that could detect and neutralize superhuman abilities. Recognition that modern criminal enterprises needed countermeasures against enhanced law enforcement, but they had not anticipated invisibility combined with bioelectric abilities, and Miles was able to systematically disable their electronic surveillance networks through precisely applied venom blasts that overloaded circuitry without creating obvious signs of sabotage. Each security system he compromised created opportunities for Peter to advance through the facility's northern sections, their coordinated approach multiplying the effectiveness of both their individual abilities. The first direct confrontation came when Miles encountered a group of guards who were attempting to destroy computer equipment that contained records of criminal activities spanning several years. The men were armed with weapons designed to be effective against enhanced individuals, but their tactics assumed they would be fighting opponents whose abilities they could observe and counter. Miles's venom blast disabled 3 of the guards before they realized they were under attack, while his enhanced agility allowed him to avoid the return fire that their remaining colleagues directed towards sounds and movement rather than visual targets. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds, leaving Miles in possession of criminal records that would provide law enforcement with intelligence about illegal activities throughout the region. But the real test of their partnership came when both Spider-Men converged on the facility's central operations center, where the criminals had established their final defensive position around equipment that represented years of investment in weapons manufacturing and criminal coordination. The remaining guards were the most experienced and best-equipped members of the criminal organization, professionals who had been specifically recruited because of their ability to function effectively under superhuman assault conditions. 12 guards, 4 automated weapon systems, and enough explosive devices to bring down this entire facility, Peter observed as they prepared for the final assault. They're not planning to surrender quietly. Good thing we're not planning to give them the option, Miles replied, his words carrying the confident determination of someone who had learned to trust both his abilities and his partnership with the person fighting beside him. The battle that followed was a symphony of coordinated superhuman tactics, 2 Spider-Men operating in perfect synchronization to neutralize threats that would have been overwhelming for either of them individually. Peter's experience and tactical knowledge created opportunities that Miles exploited through his unique abilities, while Miles's powers provided support and protection that allowed Peter to operate more aggressively than his usual solo tactics would have permitted. Miles's camouflage abilities allowed him to approach the automated weapon systems from angles they had not been programmed to defend, while his venom blasts provided a method for disabling electronic targeting systems without triggering the explosive devices that had been installed as final defensive measures. Peter's web-slinging and combat experience enabled him to engage multiple human opponents simultaneously, creating enough chaos and confusion to prevent coordinated tactical responses. The decisive moment came when they realized that the facility's self-destruct system had been activated by the criminals as a final gesture of spite, designed to eliminate evidence, even if it meant destroying the underground complex and potentially damaging the buildings above. The countdown system gave them approximately 4 minutes to evacuate the area or find a way to disable explosives that had been distributed throughout the facility's structural supports. "Can you reach the detonation control system?" Peter asked, his voice carrying the focused urgency of someone who was calculating distances and timing under life-or-death pressure. "Not in time," Miles replied after assessing the tactical situation with the enhanced reflexes that allowed him to process multiple variables simultaneously. "But I might be able to overload it if you can get me close enough to the primary control node." What followed was the most complex web-slinging sequence that either of them had ever attempted. Peter using his experience to create a path through the facility's corridors that would bring Miles within range of the control systems while avoiding the explosive devices that could be triggered by impact or vibration. Miles contributed his own mobility and camouflage abilities to avoid detection by security systems that were still attempting to prevent unauthorized access to critical infrastructure. The approach to the control node required movement through spaces that were barely large enough for human passage, crawling through ventilation systems and maintenance tunnels, while explosive devices counted down toward detonation times that would eliminate any possibility of escape. Miles found himself applying every technique he had learned about moving through confined spaces under pressure, his enhanced senses allowing him to navigate through darkness and obstacles that would have stopped normal human infiltration efforts. The venom blast that disabled the self-destruct system was the most precisely calibrated electrical discharge that Miles had ever attempted, requiring enough power to overload sophisticated electronic systems while avoiding the kind of energy surge that might trigger the very explosives he was trying to neutralize. The margin for error was essentially 0, but the blast worked exactly as intended, shutting down the countdown sequence with less than 30 seconds remaining. "Nice work." Peter observed as they emerged from the underground facility, with evidence that would allow law enforcement to dismantle criminal networks throughout the region. That was some seriously impressive teamwork. Miles felt the comments settle into his consciousness, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Recognition that their partnership had evolved beyond simple coordination into something approaching genuine collaboration. They were not competing for the same role or duplicating each other's efforts. They were multiplying their individual effectiveness through combined action that took advantage of their different strengths and abilities. The media coverage of the operation introduced the concept of Spider-Men to a public that was still adjusting to the presence of multiple enhanced individuals operating under the same heroic identity. News reports described the successful dismantling of a major criminal operation through the coordinated efforts of both New York Spider-Men, language that suggested acceptance of the partnership rather than confusion about conflicting claims to the same heroic name. "I think it's working," Genki observed during one of their strategy sessions, his voice carrying the analytical enthusiasm that he brought to all aspects of superhuman logistics. "The public is starting to think of you as partners rather than competitors, and criminals are having to plan for two different sets of abilities instead of just preparing for standard Spider-Man tactics." The partnership that emerged from that first major collaboration established patterns that would define their relationship for years to come. Peter's experience provided strategic guidance and tactical knowledge that shortened Miles's learning curve considerably, while Miles' unique abilities created opportunities and solutions that enhanced Peter's effectiveness in ways that had never been possible when he operated alone. But more than tactical advantages, their collaboration provided emotional support that neither of them had fully anticipated. Being Spider-Man was inherently isolating, requiring secrecy and self-reliance that made it difficult to share the psychological burdens that came with superhuman responsibility. Having another person who understood those burdens from personal experience created opportunities for mutual support that made the weight of heroic duty more manageable for both of them. "The thing about being Spider-Man," Peter observed during one of their conversations, "is that most people can't really understand what it's like to have the power to help everyone and the responsibility to actually do it. Having someone else who gets that makes the whole thing feel less lonely." Miles nodded, understanding that Peter was articulating something that he had been feeling but hadn't been able to express clearly. The partnership was valuable not just because it made them more effective heroes, but because it provided connection and understanding that allowed them to maintain their humanity while carrying responsibilities that could easily overwhelm individual psychological resources. The months that followed established Earth 616 as a reality where two Spider-Men could operate effectively without competing for territory or public recognition, their different backgrounds and abilities, creating a partnership that was stronger than either of them would have been individually. Miles learned from Peter's experience while contributing his own perspectives and capabilities, creating a collaborative dynamic that enhanced both their heroic careers. But perhaps most importantly, Miles discovered that being Spider-Man in Earth 616 felt like coming home in ways that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with belonging to something larger than himself. He was not trying to replace Peter Parker or live up to someone else's legacy. He was building his own version of heroic responsibility, while drawing strength from partnership with someone who understood the challenges and rewards of carrying the Spider-Man identity. Standing on a Brooklyn rooftop after another successful joint operation, Miles looked out over a city that was protected by two Spider-Men and felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. The multiverse had been destroyed and reconstructed, but the principles that defined Spider-Man had survived and thrived in forms that honored the past, while building toward a future that could accommodate multiple people, carrying forward the same heroic legacy. Peter Parker was alive and active as Spider-Man, but that didn't diminish Miles's role or importance. It enhanced both of them through partnership that multiplied their individual effectiveness, while providing the emotional support necessary to sustain heroic careers that might otherwise prove overwhelming. Miles Morales was Spider-Man in a reality where Spider-Man was a legacy large enough to contain multiple people with different backgrounds and abilities, but shared commitment to protecting those who needed protection. The adjustment had been successful beyond his most optimistic expectations, creating possibilities for heroic collaboration that had never existed in any previous reality. The city spread out below them, 8 million people living safely because two Spider-Men were willing to work together to ensure their protection. It was a good arrangement, Miles reflected, and one that could continue indefinitely, as long as both of them remained committed to the principles that had brought them together in the first place.